Kodiak destroys fishing boat. 3 missing. October 3rd, 2025. The waters off Larsen Bay had been Captain Robert James Myers' sanctuary for 37 years, a place where the rhythmic pulse of diesel engines and the salt spray kiss of the North Pacific had defined every meaningful moment of his adult life. On the morning of October 3rd, 2025, as he guided his 28-foot fishing vessel, Sarah's Dream, through the pre-dawn darkness toward his favorite salmon grounds, 12 nautical miles southwest of Kodiak Island, Robert could not have imagined that these familiar waters would become his tomb, or that the apex predator lurking beneath the surface would transform his routine fishing expedition into a nightmare that would haunt the Alaskan fishing community for generations. Robert James Myers, born on March 15, 1962, in the weathered fishing village of Cordova, Alaska, had inherited his love for the sea from his father, Captain Eugene "Gene" Myers, a third-generation fisherman whose own father had arrived from Norway in 1923 with nothing but calloused hands and an unshakable faith in the ocean's bounty. Robert's earliest memories were saturated with the scent of diesel fuel and fish blood, the groaning protest of deck winches hauling in nets heavy with silver salmon, and the perpetual ache in his small hands as he helped his father mend nets in the amber glow of their kitchen table lamp during Cordova's endless winter nights. By age 12, Robert was spending every summer aboard his father's boat, the Nordic Star, learning to read weather patterns in cloud formations, to sense fish movements in the subtle changes of watercolor and current, and most importantly, to respect the raw, untamed power of the Alaskan wilderness that surrounded their floating workplace. The defining moment of Robert's youth came during the brutal storm season of 1978, when he was 16 years old and working his first full season as official crew aboard the Nordic Star. They had been fishing the dangerous waters near the Aleutian Islands when a sudden squall, born from the collision of two massive weather systems over the Bering Sea, transformed their routine trip into a fight for survival. For 14 hours, Robert worked alongside his father and 2 seasoned crew members, battling mountainous waves that towered 30 feet above their wheelhouse, winds that screamed across the deck with enough force to tear away anything not welded down, and the constant terrifying possibility that their vessel would be overwhelmed by the ocean's fury. When the storm finally broke and they limped back to port with a cracked hull and damaged engine, Robert's father took him aside and spoke words that would echo in his mind for decades. "The sea gives and the sea takes, son. Never forget that every time we go out there, we're borrowing time from something bigger than ourselves. Respect it, read it, but never think you can control it." Those words shaped Robert's approach to fishing for the next 4 decades, instilling in him a cautious respect for the ocean's power while never diminishing his love for the profession that had claimed so many men from his hometown. After his father's death from lung cancer in 1995, Robert inherited the Nordic Star but sold her within a year, using the proceeds to purchase a smaller, more maneuverable vessel that he christened Sarah's Dream, in honor of his wife, Sarah Elizabeth Myers, née Thompson, whom he had married in a small ceremony at the Cordova Community Center in 1989. Sarah Thompson Myers, born November 7, 1965, in Anchorage, Alaska, had moved to Cordova in 1987 to work as a nurse at the town's small medical clinic. Drawn by an adventurous spirit and a desire to serve communities that most medical professionals considered too remote and challenging, she met Robert during his recovery from a fishing accident that had left him with a deep laceration on his left forearm from a snapping cable, and their courtship unfolded over the course of the following salmon season, with Sarah learning to appreciate the rhythms of fishing life, and Robert discovering that love could be as deep and mysterious as the ocean itself. Their marriage produced 2 children, Rebecca Ann Myers, born in 1991, who would grow up to become a marine biologist studying salmon populations in southeast Alaska, and Michael Robert Myers, born in 1994, who followed his father's path into commercial fishing and currently operates his own vessel out of Seward, Alaska. By 2025, Robert had evolved from the eager young fisherman of his youth into one of the most respected captains in the Kodiak Island fleet, known for his meticulous attention to safety, his uncanny ability to locate fish when others returned empty-handed, and his willingness to mentor younger fishermen in the traditions and skills that had sustained his family for generations. His reputation was built not only on his fishing success, but on his record of bringing his crew home safe after every trip, a distinction that carried particular weight in a profession where widows were created with devastating regularity. The Sarah's Dream, though modest in size compared to some of the factory ships that worked the same waters, was maintained to the highest standards, with every piece of safety equipment inspected and updated according to Coast Guard regulations and Robert's own exacting requirements. The first crew member aboard the Sarah's Dream on that fateful October morning was Tom Patrick Riley, a 28-year-old fisherman from the small community of Old Harbor on Kodiak Island, whose own path to the sea had been carved by economic necessity and family tragedy. Tom Riley was born on August 23, 1997, to Patrick and Mary Riley, both members of the Alutiiq tribe, whose ancestors had fished these waters for thousands of years before Russian fur traders and American fishermen arrived to claim their slice of the ocean's bounty. Tom's childhood in Old Harbor had been marked by the gradual erosion of traditional subsistence fishing practices as commercial operations increasingly dominated the local economy, forcing many young Alutiiq men to choose between leaving their ancestral lands for work in Anchorage or other urban centers, or adapting to the commercial fishing industry that now controlled access to their traditional fishing grounds. Tom's father, Patrick Riley, had chosen the latter path, working as crew on various fishing vessels throughout the 1980s and 1990s, while struggling with the alcoholism that had claimed so many men in his community, a disease that stemmed partly from the cultural displacement and economic frustration that followed the transformation of their traditional way of life. Patrick's drinking escalated throughout Tom's teenage years, culminating in a fatal car accident in 2015 when Tom was 18 years old, leaving behind a widow, 2 younger children, and a son who suddenly found himself responsible for supporting a family while processing his own grief and anger at his father's self-destructive choices. Tom's introduction to commercial fishing came through a family connection to Captain Robert Myers, whose wife Sarah had worked with Tom's mother Mary at the Kodiak Area Native Association Health Clinic during the mid-2000s. When Tom approached Robert in 2016, desperate for work that could provide the steady income his family needed, Robert saw something in the young man's eyes that reminded him of his own determination at that age, a hunger that came not from ambition but from necessity, tempered by the kind of resilience that the Alaskan wilderness demanded from all its children. Robert took Tom aboard as a greenhorn, the lowest position in the fishing hierarchy, but Tom's work ethic, natural understanding of weather and water, and willingness to take on any task without complaint quickly earned him promotion to full crew member. Over the 9 years that followed, Tom Riley evolved from an inexperienced young man struggling to support his family into one of Robert's most trusted crew members, someone who could anticipate the captain's needs before they were spoken, who could read the subtle signs of changing weather or fish movement with an intuition that couldn't be taught, only developed through years of patient observation and hard-won experience. Tom's knowledge of local waters came not only from his years aboard the Sarah's Dream, but from generations of ancestral memory, stories and techniques passed down through his mother's family line, creating a unique blend of traditional Alutiiq fishing wisdom and modern commercial fishing methods that made him invaluable to Robert's operation. By 2025, Tom had purchased a small house in Old Harbour where he lived with his girlfriend, Jennifer Marie Koniag, a teacher at the local elementary school, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia Rose Riley, whose bright eyes and infectious laughter had become the centre of Tom's universe. His mother, Mary, lived in a small apartment above the Old Harbour General Store, her health stabilised after years of diabetes management, supported by the steady income Tom provided from his work aboard the Sarah's Dream. Tom's younger brother, David, had enlisted in the army and was stationed in Germany, while his sister Patricia worked as a social worker in Anchorage, creating a family network that had slowly rebuilt itself around Tom's success as a fisherman. The third crew member completing the Sarah's Dreams complement on October 3rd was Victor Manuel Cruz, a 45-year-old fisherman whose journey to Alaskan waters had begun 30 years earlier in the fishing village of Manzanillo, Mexico, where he was born on December 12, 1979, to a family whose livelihood had depended on small boat fishing in the Pacific waters off Mexico's western coast for generations. Victor's father, Manuel Cruz, operated a 20-foot panga from which he caught Sierra, Dorado and other species that he sold in the local markets, while his mother, Rosa Elena Cruz, managed the family's finances and raised their 5 children with the kind of stern discipline that coastal Mexican families used to prepare their sons and daughters for lives that would inevitably be shaped by the ocean's mercies and cruelties. Victor's early years were spent learning the fundamentals of fishing from his father and uncles, developing skills with hand lines, nets, and the intuitive understanding of fish behavior that separated successful fishermen from those who struggled to feed their families. However, by the mid-1990s, as Victor reached his late teens, the combination of overfishing by industrial fleets, pollution from coastal development, and competition from imported fish was making it increasingly difficult for small-scale fishermen like his father to earn enough to support their families. The economic pressures that had driven millions of Mexicans northward in search of better opportunities eventually reached the Cruz family when Victor's older brother, Eduardo, departed for California in 1998, followed by his sister Carmen in 2000, both sending money home that became essential for the family's survival. Victor's own decision to leave Mexico came in 2002, when he was 23 years old and facing the prospect of watching his fishing heritage disappear, along with the economic opportunities that had sustained his family for generations. Unlike many Mexican immigrants who sought work in agriculture, construction, or service industries, Victor was determined to continue fishing, believing that his skills and knowledge could translate to success in American waters. His journey north took him first to California, where he worked aboard various fishing vessels out of San Diego and Monterey, learning English from crew members who came from every corner of the world and adapting his traditional Mexican fishing techniques to American commercial fishing methods. The work was brutal and the pay minimal. But Victor's determination to succeed and his natural ability to read water and weather patterns gradually earned him recognition among boat captains who valued skill over documentation status. By 2010, Victor had earned enough money and established sufficient connections to begin working Alaska's summer fishing season, attracted by stories of the extraordinary salmon runs and crab populations that offered earnings far beyond what was possible in California's increasingly regulated and competitive fishing grounds. Victor's first Alaska season was aboard a processing vessel working the Bering Sea crab fishery, an experience that nearly killed him when he was swept overboard during a January storm and spent 47 minutes in water cold enough to kill most men within 15 minutes, saved only by the quick thinking of a crew member who managed to throw him a life ring and the exceptional strength that allowed him to hold on until the crew could haul him back aboard. The experience taught Victor that Alaska fishing was unlike anything he had experienced in Mexican or California waters, demanding not only skill and endurance, but a level of mental toughness and physical resilience that few men possessed. Despite the dangers, Victor returned to Alaska every summer for the next decade, gradually working his way up from processing crew to deck positions on increasingly prestigious vessels, earning a reputation for reliability, skill, and the kind of steady competence under pressure that captains valued above almost any other quality. His English improved steadily, allowing him to communicate effectively with crew members and captains, while his Mexican fishing background provided unique insights into fish behavior and weather reading that complemented the local knowledge of his Alaskan colleagues. Victor's connection to Captain Robert Myers began in 2018 when he was hired as temporary crew aboard the Sarah's Dream to replace a regular crew member who had been injured in a dock accident. Robert was initially skeptical about hiring someone without local connections or long-term ties to the Kodiak fishing community, but Victor's work ethic and fishing instincts quickly overcame any reservations. Within 2 weeks, Victor had proven himself indispensable, demonstrating an ability to anticipate problems before they developed, to work efficiently in dangerous conditions, and to maintain the kind of positive attitude that helped crew morale during the long, difficult days that defined Alaska fishing. By 2025, Victor had become as integral to the Sarah's Dream's operation as Tom Riley, bringing a different but equally valuable perspective to their fishing efforts. His knowledge of fish behavior, developed through 3 decades of fishing in different environments, often provided insights that helped Robert locate productive fishing areas when other boats were struggling. More importantly, Victor's maturity and steady temperament served as a stabilizing influence during the stressful moments that inevitably arose during fishing operations, whether dealing with equipment failures, weather challenges, or the personality conflicts that could develop when men worked in close quarters under difficult conditions. Victor had never married, though he maintained close relationships with his extended family in Mexico through regular money transfers and annual visits during the winter off-season. His earnings from Alaska fishing allowed him to support not only his parents, who were now in their 70s and no longer able to fish, but also to contribute to the education costs for several nieces and nephews whose parents struggled with Mexico's ongoing economic challenges. Victor rented a small apartment in Kodiak during fishing season and spent his winters in a modest house he had purchased in Manzanillo, where he helped his father maintain their old panga and taught neighborhood children the fishing techniques his own father had passed down to him. The relationship between these 3 men, Robert, Tom, and Victor, had evolved over the years from a simple employer-employee arrangement into something resembling a family, bound together by shared experiences that few people outside the fishing community could understand. They had weathered storms together that had sunk other vessels, had celebrated exceptional fishing days when their holds were filled to capacity with premium salmon, and had supported each other through personal crises that ranged from family illnesses to financial difficulties. Robert treated both Tom and Victor as partners rather than employees, sharing profits equitably and consulting them on major decisions about fishing strategies, equipment purchases, and seasonal planning. The morning of October 3rd, 2025, began like thousands of other fishing days in the 37-year career of Captain Robert Myers. With the pre-dawn ritual of preparing the Sarah's Dream for another day, pursuing the salmon that had drawn fishermen to these waters for generations. At 4:30 a.m., as the first traces of grey light began to filter through the thick cloud cover that had settled over Kodiak Island during the night, Robert arrived at the harbour where his vessel was moored, carrying 2 thermos bottles of coffee that his wife Sarah had prepared, along with a cooler containing sandwiches, fruit, and the chocolate chip cookies that had become his traditional good luck offering to his crew. The harbour at Larsen Bay was a modest facility compared to the major ports of Kodiak or Dutch Harbour, consisting of 2 floating docks that could accommodate perhaps 20 vessels, protected by a breakwater built from massive granite blocks quarried from nearby mountains and positioned to provide shelter from the prevailing southwestern winds that could turn the bay into a maelstrom of dangerous waves within hours. On this particular morning, the harbour held 14 boats of various sizes, from small day-fishing vessels similar to Robert Sarah's Dream to larger seiner boats capable of multi-day fishing expeditions, all of them showing the wear and weathering that marked vessels subjected to the punishing conditions of North Pacific fishing. Robert's pre-departure routine had been refined over decades into a systematic inspection process that left nothing to chance, beginning with a careful examination of the engine compartment where he checked oil levels, coolant temperatures, belt tensions, and the dozens of other mechanical details that could mean the difference between a successful fishing day and a dangerous emergency miles from shore. The Sarah's Dream's engine was a Caterpillar 3126 marine diesel that Robert had installed himself in 2019, replacing the original engine that had finally succumbed to 30 years of saltwater exposure and the constant vibration of fishing operations. Robert knew every sound, every vibration, every subtle indication that might suggest developing problems, and his morning inspection revealed nothing unusual beyond the normal wear patterns that he monitored carefully and addressed through regular maintenance. The fuel tanks, which Robert had topped off the previous evening, held 340 gallons of diesel fuel, enough for 3 days of normal fishing operations with a comfortable safety margin that reflected his philosophy of always planning for unexpected delays or course changes. The freshwater tanks held 80 gallons of potable water, while emergency supplies included flares, emergency beacons, life rafts, survival suits, and enough food to sustain 3 men for a week if weather or mechanical problems prevented their return to port. Every piece of safety equipment met or exceeded Coast Guard requirements, with most items recently inspected and updated according to Robert's conservative approach to maritime safety. Tom Riley arrived at the harbour at 5 a.m., 30 minutes before his scheduled time, carrying his personal gear in a weatherproof duffel bag and a travel mug filled with coffee strong enough to wake the dead, a beverage preference he had inherited from his father and refined during his years of pre-dawn fishing departures. Tom's morning routine began with his own inspection of the fishing equipment they would use during the day, checking the condition of nets, lines, hooks, and the electronic equipment that had become essential for modern fishing operations. The fish finder, GPS navigation system, radio equipment, and depth sounder all received careful attention, with Tom verifying that backup systems were functional and that spare parts for critical components were available. Victor Cruz appeared at 5:15 a.m., punctual as always, greeting his crewmates with the quiet nods and brief exchanges that marked the beginning of another working day, among men who had fished together long enough to communicate through subtle gestures and shared understanding. Victor's preparation focused on the deck equipment and rigging that would be used during fishing operations, inspecting winches, pulleys, cables, and the 1,000 other pieces of hardware that needed to function perfectly when fish were running, and every minute of delay could mean lost income. At 5:30 a.m., with all preparations complete and weather conditions appearing favorable despite the overcast sky and light wind from the southeast, Robert fired up the Sarah's Dream's engine, listening carefully to the steady rumble that indicated all systems were functioning normally. The marine weather forecast, received through their VHF radio, predicted partly cloudy skies with winds from the southwest at 10 to 15 knots, sea conditions calm to moderate, and visibility improving throughout the morning as the cloud cover dissipated. Surface water temperature was holding steady at 48 degrees Fahrenheit, ideal for the late-season salmon fishing they planned to pursue. As the Sarah's Dream backed away from the dock and turned toward the harbour entrance, Robert could see other fishing vessels beginning their own departures, creating a small flotilla of boats heading toward fishing grounds that stretched from nearshore waters to areas 50 miles offshore. The camaraderie among Kodiak fishermen was evident in the radio chatter that filled the VHF frequencies, with captains sharing information about fish sightings, weather conditions, and good-natured banter that helped pass the time during long transits to fishing areas. The transit from Larsen Bay to Robert's preferred fishing grounds would take approximately 90 minutes at their cruising speed of 12 knots, following a course that would take them southwest past Raspberry Island, through the channel between Afognak Island and the Kodiak Island mainland, then northwest toward the underwater bank structure where salmon typically concentrated during their feeding migrations. Robert had discovered this particular area 15 years earlier during a season when traditional fishing spots had been disappointingly unproductive. And over the years, it had become one of his most reliable locations for finding premium salmon when other fishermen were struggling. The waters they would fish ranged from 180 to 240 feet deep, with underwater topography that created the upwelling currents and nutrient concentrations that attracted the small fish and marine organisms that salmon fed upon. The area was approximately 12 nautical miles from the nearest land, far enough from shore to avoid the recreational fishing pressure that could spook fish in near-shore areas, but close enough to allow quick returns to port if weather conditions deteriorated or mechanical problems developed. As they settled into the steady rhythm of the transit, Robert stood at the wheel in the small wheelhouse, monitoring their course and continuously scanning the horizon for other vessels, floating debris, or the subtle changes in watercolor and surface conditions that might indicate fish activity or weather changes. Tom and Victor occupied themselves with final preparations of fishing equipment, discussing strategies for the day based on recent reports of fish movements and their own observations of water conditions and weather patterns. The conversation among the three men reflected the kind of professional relationship that had developed over years of working together in conditions that demanded absolute trust and mutual dependence. Robert shared his thoughts on where they might find fish based on water temperatures, tidal conditions, and reports from other fishermen, while Tom and Victor contributed their own observations and suggestions, creating a collaborative approach to fishing that had proven successful year after year. At 6:45 a.m., as the Sarah's Dream approached the fishing grounds, Robert reduced engine speed and began making the electronic adjustments that would allow them to locate fish concentrations using their sonar equipment. The fish finder began painting targets on its screen, showing scattered individual fish and small groups that suggested they had arrived at a productive area. Tom and Victor moved to their positions on deck, preparing the fishing gear they would deploy once Robert identified the most promising fishing locations. The morning sun, though filtered through persistent cloud cover, was beginning to provide enough light to see clearly beyond the immediate vicinity of their vessel, revealing an ocean surface marked by the gentle swells that characterized calm conditions in the North Pacific. The watercolor was the deep blue-green that experienced fishermen associated with productive fishing areas, while the surface temperature readings confirmed that they were fishing in waters that should hold good concentrations of salmon. At 7 a.m., Robert shut down the main engine and allowed the Sarah's Dream to drift while they prepared to begin fishing operations. Tom and Victor worked with the practiced efficiency that came from years of repetition, rigging lines and preparing the trolling gear they would use to target salmon in the area Robert had selected based on his sonar readings and knowledge of fish behavior patterns in these particular waters. The fishing method they employed was trolling, a technique that involved pulling multiple lines behind the boat at controlled speeds and depths, using downriggers and other specialized equipment to present their lures at the precise depths where salmon were feeding. This method required constant attention to boat speed, line positions, and the subtle indications that suggested fish activity, but when executed properly by experienced fishermen, it was one of the most effective ways to catch salmon in open ocean water. As they began their first trolling pass through the area, Robert restarted the engine and brought the Sarah's Dream up to trolling speed, approximately 4 knots, while Tom and Victor monitored the lines that stretched behind the boat at various depths and distances. The rhythm of trolling fishing was hypnotic, with the steady purr of the engine, the gentle rocking motion of the boat in the swells, and the constant vigilance required to detect the subtle changes in line tension or boat behavior that might indicate a fish had taken one of their lures. By 8:30 a.m., they had completed 2 trolling passes through the area without success, but Robert was not discouraged, knowing that salmon fishing often required patience and persistence before fish began biting. The fish finder continued to show promising targets, and conditions remained favorable, with light winds and calm seas that made fishing operations comfortable and safe. At 8:45 a.m., as they began their 3rd trolling pass, Tom suddenly straightened and pointed toward one of the downrigger lines, where the rod tip was beginning to pulse with the distinctive rhythm that indicated a fish had taken their lure. Victor quickly moved to assist, as Tom began the careful process of fighting what appeared to be a good-sized salmon, using techniques that balanced the need to land the fish quickly with the caution required to avoid breaking the line or losing the fish to aggressive fighting tactics. The battle lasted 12 minutes, with the salmon making several powerful runs that stripped line from Tom's reel before he could gradually work the fish closer to the boat. When Victor finally slipped the landing net under a beautiful 32-pound king salmon, all 3 men felt the satisfaction that came from a successful conclusion to the careful process of locating, hooking, and landing a premium fish. The success of their first fish energized the crew and validated Robert's choice of fishing location, suggesting that they had indeed found productive waters that might yield the kind of exceptional fishing day that every fisherman hoped for but experienced only occasionally. They quickly reset their lines and continued trolling, optimistic that more fish would follow. Over the next 2 hours, their optimism proved justified as they landed 6 more salmon, ranging in size from 18 to 28 pounds, all prime fish that would command excellent prices in the Kodiak fish markets. The action was steady enough to keep all 3 men busy, but not so frantic that they couldn't enjoy the satisfaction of successful fishing and the camaraderie that came from working together toward a common goal. At 11 a.m., as they paused to ice their catch and grab a quick lunch of sandwiches and coffee, the 3 men were in excellent spirits, discussing the possibility of continuing to fish the same area or exploring nearby waters that might hold even larger concentrations of salmon. The weather remained favorable, with partly cloudy skies and light winds that created ideal fishing conditions, while their fuel consumption had been minimal, leaving them with plenty of options for the remainder of the day. It was during this lunch break, as they drifted in the gentle swells approximately 12 nautical miles southwest of Larsen Bay, that the first indication of trouble appeared in the form of unusual splashing sounds coming from an area roughly 200 yards east of their position. Robert initially dismissed the disturbance as seal or whale activity, common in waters where fish were concentrated, but as the splashing continued and seemed to be moving closer to their location, he became more curious about its source. Tom was the first to spot the massive brown shape moving through the water with surprising speed, initially thinking it might be a large piece of floating debris or perhaps a dead whale. But as the object continued to approach their vessel, its purposeful movement and the distinctive swimming motion became impossible to misinterpret. What they were witnessing was a Kodiak brown bear, the largest subspecies of brown bear in North America, swimming directly toward their fishing vessel with the steady, powerful stroke that these massive predators use to travel between islands in search of food. Kodiak brown bears, known scientifically as Ursus arctos middendorfi, are found exclusively on the Kodiak archipelago in southwestern Alaska, where they have evolved over thousands of years to become the largest bears in the world, with adult males routinely exceeding 1,500 pounds and standing over 10 feet tall when reared on their hind legs. These magnificent predators are excellent swimmers, capable of covering distances of several miles between islands, and are known to pursue salmon runs into coastal waters where fish concentrate during spawning migrations. The bear approaching the Sarah's Dream was clearly a mature male, identifiable by his massive size and the distinctive shoulder hump that marked him as one of the dominant boars that controlled the best feeding territories on Kodiak Island. His thick, dark brown fur was soaked with seawater, but still provided the insulation necessary for survival in the cold North Pacific waters, while his powerful limbs propelled him through the swells with a grace that belied his enormous bulk. Robert's first instinct was to start the engine and move away from the approaching bear, recognizing that while bear encounters on land were relatively common in Alaska, meeting one of these massive predators in open water was an extraordinarily rare and potentially dangerous situation. However, as he reached for the engine controls, he hesitated, partly from curiosity about this unusual wildlife encounter, and partly from a confidence born of 37 years of fishing experience that suggested the bear would simply swim past their vessel without showing any interest in the boat or its occupants. Tom and Victor stood at the rail, watching in fascination as the bear continued its approach, both men aware that they were witnessing something that few people had ever seen and that would make an incredible story to share with other fishermen back in port. Victor reached for his cell phone to capture video of the encounter, while Tom grabbed a pair of binoculars to get a better view of the bear's size and condition. At a distance of approximately 100 yards, the bear's true size became apparent, with his massive head and shoulders clearly visible above the water surface as he continued swimming directly toward their boat. Robert estimated the bear's weight at well over 1,200 pounds, making him one of the largest Kodiak bears any of them had ever seen, even in photographs or wildlife documentaries. The bear's small, dark eyes were fixed on their vessel with an intensity that began to make Robert uncomfortable, suggesting that this was not a casual encounter with a bear that happened to be swimming in the area. As the distance closed to 50 yards, Robert finally decided that discretion was the better part of valor and reached for the engine start button. But before he could activate the starter, the bear suddenly accelerated, swimming with a powerful stroke that propelled him through the water at a speed that none of the men had expected. Within seconds, the gap between bear and boat had closed to 20 yards, then 10 yards, and suddenly the massive predator was alongside the Sarah's Dream, his enormous paws grasping for the gunwale with the same motion he would use to haul himself onto a rocky shore. What happened next unfolded with the kind of dreamlike clarity that often marks traumatic events, with each detail burned into memory with vivid precision, while the overall sequence of events seemed to occur in slow motion. The bear's massive paws, each the size of dinner plates and equipped with claws longer than a man's fingers, found purchase on the Sarah's Dream's gunwale, and with a display of raw power that defied comprehension, the 1,200-pound predator began hauling himself out of the water and onto the fishing vessel. Robert shouted a warning to his crew as he desperately tried to start the engine, but the bear's weight and the dynamic forces of his climbing motion immediately began to destabilize the 28-foot vessel, causing it to list dramatically to starboard as water poured over the rail where the bear was hauling himself aboard. Tom and Victor scrambled toward the port side of the boat, instinctively trying to balance the vessel's weight distribution. But their combined weight was insignificant compared to the massive bear that was now halfway onto their deck. The Sarah's Dream, designed for fishing operations in calm to moderate seas, was never intended to support the weight and dynamic forces generated by a 1,200-pound bear climbing aboard from the water. As the bear's hindquarters cleared the gunwale and his full weight settled onto the starboard deck, the vessel's center of gravity shifted beyond its design limits, causing a catastrophic loss of stability that no amount of human effort could counteract. Victor, standing near the port rail with his cell phone still in his hand, watched in horror as the bear, now fully aboard their vessel, shook himself like an enormous dog, sending sprays of seawater across the deck, while his small, dark eyes surveyed the three men who had suddenly found themselves trapped aboard a sinking vessel with one of nature's most formidable predators. The bear's massive head, larger than a basketball and equipped with jaws capable of crushing a moose skull, turned toward Victor with the kind of predatory focus that had been refined over millions of years of evolution. Tom, closer to the wheelhouse, and Robert grabbed for the emergency radio handset, intending to broadcast a mayday call that might bring help, but before he could key the microphone, the Sarah's Dreams list increased dramatically as the bear moved across the deck, causing tools, equipment and loose gear to slide toward the low side of the vessel and adding to the forces that were driving the boat toward capsizing. Robert, still struggling with the engine controls, realized that their situation had progressed beyond any possibility of escape by conventional means. The bear's presence on their vessel had created a death spiral of instability that would culminate in capsizing within minutes, and their only hope of survival lay in somehow getting off the boat before it went under. However, the bear's position on the deck blocked access to the life raft container, while the vessel's extreme list made movement across the deck treacherous and potentially fatal. The bear, meanwhile, seemed remarkably calm considering the chaos his presence had created, moving with careful deliberation across the tilting deck, as if evaluating the situation and deciding how to proceed. His massive size and the confidence of his movements suggested that this was not the first time he had encountered humans in a marine environment, raising the terrifying possibility that this particular bear had learned to associate fishing boats with easy access to food. As the Sarah's Dreams list increased beyond 30 degrees, Robert abandoned his efforts to start the engine and grabbed for the emergency beacon that would alert Coast Guard rescue coordinators to their position. But before he could activate the device, a massive wave, generated by the vessel's unstable motion in the swells, washed over the low side of the boat, flooding the engine compartment and ensuring that any hope of powering away from their predicament was now lost. Tom, realizing that their situation had become desperate, began working his way toward the emergency equipment locker where survival suits and additional flotation devices were stored. But the bear's attention was suddenly focused on Tom's movement, and the massive predator began moving in his direction with a purposeful gait that suggested predatory intent rather than casual interest. Victor, still standing near the port rail, found himself in the surreal position of being the safest person aboard a vessel that was actively sinking, with his position offering the clearest access to the water if abandoning ship became necessary. However, the prospect of entering the 48-degree waters of the North Pacific, even wearing the survival suit he hoped to retrieve from the emergency locker, was only marginally preferable to remaining aboard a sinking vessel with an enormous bear. The physics of their situation were inexorable, with the Sarah's Dreams' stability compromised beyond any possibility of recovery, and the vessel's list increasing with each passing minute as water continued to pour through the scuppers and over the gunwale. Robert's 37 years of fishing experience had taught him to read the signs of impending disaster, and every indication suggested that they had perhaps 5 minutes before the vessel capsized completely, trapping them beneath tons of sinking metal and equipment. As if sensing the urgency of their situation, the bear suddenly reared up on his hind legs, towering over the three men with a display of raw power and size that transformed their already desperate situation into a scene from their worst nightmares. Standing at his full height, the bear's massive frame blocked out the overcast sky, while his huge paws, still dripping with seawater, gestured in the air with movements that could crush human skulls as easily as breaking eggs. Robert, abandoning any hope of saving his vessel, shouted to his crew to grab whatever flotation devices they could reach and prepare to abandon ship, but his words were nearly drowned out by the groaning protest of the Sarah's Dream's hull as structural members began failing under the extraordinary stresses created by the vessel's extreme list and the dynamic forces generated by the bear's movements. Tom, closest to the emergency equipment, managed to grab 2 survival suits from the locker before the bear's attention fixed on him with predatory intensity, causing the massive animal to drop back to all fours and begin moving in Tom's direction with a speed that seemed impossible for such an enormous creature. Tom's only escape route led toward the stern of the vessel, where the deck was already partially submerged, and where moving water created additional hazards for anyone attempting to navigate the treacherous surface. Victor, recognizing that their window for escape was closing rapidly, made the decision to abandon ship immediately, dropping his cell phone and climbing over the port rail into the frigid waters of the North Pacific without the benefit of a survival suit or additional flotation beyond his life jacket. The shock of immersion in 48-degree water hit him like a physical blow, causing involuntary gasping and muscle contractions that immediately began sapping his strength and coordination. Robert, seeing Victor enter the water, grabbed the vessel's emergency beacon and activated it before following Victor's example and abandoning the sinking Sarah's Dream, hoping that the distress signal would alert rescue authorities to their position before hypothermia and drowning claimed all 3 crew members. The icy water was a brutal assault on his system, causing immediate disorientation and the beginnings of hypothermic shock that would quickly progress to unconsciousness if rescue did not arrive soon. Tom, trapped between the advancing bear and the sinking stern of the vessel, made a desperate leap toward the water, but his timing was fatally compromised by the Sarah's Dream's final roll toward capsizing. As the vessel's list passed the point of no return, Tom's jump carried him not into clear water, but into the rigging and debris field that surrounded the sinking boat, where cables, nets, and loose equipment created a deadly tangle that caught his legs and dragged him beneath the surface. The Sarah's Dream's final moments were accompanied by the sounds that mark the death of every vessel, the groaning of metal under impossible stress, the rushing of water filling compartments never meant to hold it, and the desperate splashing of men fighting for their lives in water cold enough to kill them within minutes. The bear, finding himself aboard a vessel that was actively sinking beneath him, attempted to leap back into the water, but his enormous weight and the vessel's chaotic motion conspired to trap him as well, creating a scene of destruction that would haunt the nightmares of anyone who witnessed it. As the Sarah's Dream disappeared beneath the surface of the North Pacific, carrying with her the hopes, dreams, and accumulated experience of 3 generations of Alaska fishermen, the only evidence of the tragedy was the debris field that marked her final position, the emergency beacon broadcasting its automated distress signal, and 3 men struggling to survive in water that would kill them long before any rescue could arrive. Robert Myers, treading water in his life jacket while fighting the effects of hypothermia and shock, could see Victor Cruz approximately 50 yards away, also struggling to maintain his position at the surface while the cold water steadily drained his strength and coordination. Of Tom Riley, there was no sign, with the debris field from the sinking vessel creating a chaotic environment where a man could disappear beneath the surface without a trace. The emergency beacon, designed to operate for a minimum of 48 hours, while broadcasting GPS coordinates and vessel identification information, was functioning perfectly, sending its distress signal to satellites that would relay the information to Coast Guard rescue coordination centers in Juneau and Anchorage. However, the beacon's effectiveness depended entirely on the speed of the rescue response, and even under the best circumstances, helicopter rescue operations from Kodiak Island would require at least 90 minutes to reach their position. In 48-degree water, wearing only street clothes and standard life jackets, the survival time for Robert and Victor was estimated at 30 to 40 minutes before hypothermia would cause unconsciousness, followed by death within an hour of immersion. Their only hope lay in the possibility that other fishing vessels working nearby waters might hear their mayday calls and respond more quickly than official rescue services. But the VHF radio was now resting on the bottom of the North Pacific, along with the Sarah's Dream and all of her equipment. Robert's experience with cold water survival, gained through years of fishing in some of the world's most dangerous waters, told him that their situation was probably hopeless, but his determination to survive and return to his wife Sarah and their children drove him to continue fighting against the effects of hypothermia and the despair that could kill a man as quickly as the cold water itself. He began swimming slowly toward Victor, hoping that they could support each other and perhaps extend their survival time by sharing body heat and providing mutual encouragement. Victor, whose experience with cold water was limited to the warmer waters off Mexico's Pacific coast, was struggling more severely with the effects of hypothermia, his body's core temperature dropping rapidly as the cold water overwhelmed his body's ability to generate heat. His swimming ability, developed during childhood in the warm waters near Manzanillo, was compromised by the bulky life jacket and the numbing effects of the cold, making every movement a monumental effort that further drained his dwindling energy reserves. As the minutes passed and no rescue appeared on the horizon, both men began to experience the psychological effects of their situation, with the reality of their probable death beginning to penetrate the shock and adrenaline that had initially masked the full horror of their circumstances. Robert found himself thinking about his wife Sarah, about the conversations they would never have, about the grandchildren he would never meet, while Victor's thoughts turned to his family in Mexico and the money he would no longer be able to send to support his parents and extended family. The debris field around the Sarah's Dream's final position continued to spread as currents and wind scattered the flotsam that marked the vessel's grave, with pieces of equipment, fragments of the wheelhouse, and sections of decking creating a chaotic maze of floating obstacles that made swimming difficult and dangerous. Among this debris, there was still no sign of Tom Riley, whose fate remained unknown to his struggling crewmates. At 12:47 p.m., 47 minutes after the Sarah's Dream had slipped beneath the surface, Robert Myers lost consciousness from hypothermia while floating in his life jacket approximately 200 yards from the vessel's last known position. His body, still supported by the flotation device, continued to drift with the prevailing current, but his core body temperature had dropped to levels incompatible with consciousness, and without immediate rescue and medical intervention, he would be dead within minutes. Victor Cruz, fighting the same physiological battle against hypothermia, managed to remain conscious for another 8 minutes before the cold finally overwhelmed his system, causing him to slip into the unconsciousness that marked the beginning of the final phase of cold water drowning. His body, like Robert's, continued to float with the support of his life jacket, but the window for successful rescue was rapidly closing. At 1:15 p.m., 75 minutes after the emergency beacon had begun broadcasting its distress signal, the first rescue aircraft appeared on the horizon in the form of an HH-60 Jayhawk helicopter from Coast Guard Air Station Kodiak, dispatched as soon as the distress signal had been received and the vessel's registration information had been processed through Coast Guard databases. The helicopter crew, consisting of Pilot Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, co-pilot Lieutenant James Rodriguez, Flight Mechanic Petty Officer First Class Michael Thompson, and Rescue Swimmer Petty Officer Second Class David Kim, had responded to the emergency with the kind of professional urgency that marked Coast Guard rescue operations in Alaska's dangerous waters. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, the helicopter's aircraft commander, was a 15-year Coast Guard veteran who had flown rescue missions in some of the world's most challenging environments, from hurricane evacuations in the Gulf of Mexico to ice rescue operations in the Bering Sea. Born in Portland, Oregon, in 1985, Sarah had joined the Coast Guard immediately after graduating from the University of Oregon with a degree in aviation management, drawn by the service's mission of saving lives and protecting mariners in distress. Her flight training had taken her through the rigorous Coast Guard flight school at Naval Air Station Pensacola, where she had demonstrated the combination of technical skill and decision-making ability that marked successful rescue pilots. Over her 15-year career, Sarah had accumulated more than 4,000 flight hours in Coast Guard aircraft, including extensive experience in the HH-60 Jayhawk helicopter that had become the backbone of Coast Guard rescue operations in Alaska. Her logbook included more than 200 successful rescue missions, ranging from medical evacuations from remote villages to dramatic rescues of fishermen from sinking vessels in storm-tossed seas. She had received numerous commendations for her performance under dangerous conditions, including the Distinguished Flying Cross for her role in rescuing 14 crew members from a burning cargo ship during a winter storm in the Gulf of Alaska. Sarah's co-pilot, Lieutenant James Antonio Rodriguez, was a newer addition to the Coast Guard aviation community, having graduated from flight school just 18 months earlier, but his training and natural ability had quickly earned him recognition as one of the most promising young pilots in the service. Born in San Antonio, Texas, in 1997, James had joined the Coast Guard after completing his degree in aeronautical engineering at Texas A&M University, motivated by a desire to use his technical knowledge in service to others and drawn by the challenging flying conditions that Alaska operations offered. The flight mechanic, Petty Officer First Class Michael Patrick Thompson, was responsible for the helicopter's mechanical systems and would serve as the crew's eyes and ears during the rescue operation, monitoring aircraft performance while assisting with the complex logistics of recovering survivors from the water. Thompson, a 20-year Coast Guard veteran from Anchorage, Alaska, had participated in hundreds of rescue missions and possessed the kind of intuitive understanding of helicopter operations that came only through years of experience in challenging conditions. The rescue swimmer, Petty Officer Second Class David Sung Kim, would be responsible for entering the water to assist survivors who were unable to help themselves, a role that required exceptional physical conditioning, swimming ability, and the kind of mental toughness necessary to function effectively in life-threatening situations. Kim, born in Honolulu, Hawaii in 1994, had completed the grueling Coast Guard Rescue Swimmer School where the failure rate exceeded 80% and had proven his abilities in dozens of water rescues throughout Alaska's coastal waters. As the Jayhawk helicopter approached the coordinates provided by the emergency beacon, the crew began the systematic search pattern that would allow them to locate survivors in the debris field left by the sinking Sarah's Dream. Flying at an altitude of 500 feet and an airspeed of 80 knots, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell began an expanding square search pattern centered on the beacon's location, while her crew scanned the water surface for any sign of survivors or additional debris that might indicate the vessel's final position. The search conditions were challenging, with an overcast sky that limited visibility and sea conditions that made it difficult to distinguish between survivors floating in life jackets and the various pieces of debris that marked the Sarah's Dream's final position. However, the crew's training and experience had prepared them for exactly these conditions, and within 12 minutes of beginning their search, Petty Officer Thompson spotted what appeared to be a person floating in a life jacket approximately 300 yards northeast of the beacon's position. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell immediately maneuvered the helicopter into position above the floating figure, which closer inspection revealed to be an unconscious man in his 60s, wearing the type of life jacket commonly used by commercial fishermen. The man showed no signs of movement or consciousness, but his position in the water and the support provided by his flotation device suggested that rescue might still be possible if they could get him out of the water and begin rewarming procedures immediately. Petty Officer Kim quickly donned his rescue gear and entered the water via the helicopter's rescue basket, immediately swimming toward the unconscious figure while fighting the effects of the 48-degree water that began sapping his strength within seconds of immersion. Kim's training had prepared him for these conditions, and his dry suit provided protection against hypothermia that would allow him to function effectively for 30 to 40 minutes in the frigid water. The rescue of the first survivor, who would later be identified as Captain Robert Myers, required careful coordination between the swimmer in the water and the helicopter crew, with Kim securing Myers in a rescue harness before signaling for extraction. The process of lifting an unconscious hypothermia victim from the water while maintaining the helicopter's position in gusty wind conditions demanded the highest level of skill from all crew members, but their training and experience proved equal to the challenge. As Robert Myers was lifted into the helicopter and flight mechanic Thompson began emergency medical procedures designed to stabilize hypothermia victims, the search continued for additional survivors. Within 8 minutes, Petty Officer Kim had located Victor Cruz, floating unconscious, approximately 400 yards from Myers' position, also supported by his life jacket, but showing even fewer signs of life after his longer exposure to the deadly cold water. The rescue of Victor Cruz followed the same careful procedures that had been used for Robert Myers, with Kim again entering the water to secure the victim before signaling for extraction. However, Cruz's condition appeared more critical, with his skin showing the grey pallor that indicated severe hypothermia and his breathing so shallow as to be barely detectable. Thompson immediately began more aggressive rewarming procedures while monitoring Cruz's vital signs for any indication of cardiac arrest or other life-threatening complications. Despite extensive searching that continued for another 45 minutes, covering an area of nearly 4 square miles around the Sarah's Dream's last known position, no trace of Tom Riley was found. The debris field was thoroughly examined, with the helicopter crew identifying pieces of the vessel's wheelhouse, sections of decking, fishing equipment, and personal items that had belonged to the crew, but no additional survivors were located. At 2:45 p.m., with fuel levels requiring a return to base and both rescued survivors requiring immediate advanced medical treatment, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell made the decision to terminate the search and proceed directly to Providence Kodiak Island Medical Center, where trauma teams were standing by to treat severe hypothermia victims. The flight to Kodiak would take 22 minutes, during which time flight mechanic Thompson would continue providing emergency medical care while monitoring both patients for signs of cardiac arrest or other complications that commonly occurred during the rewarming process. The emergency medical treatment of severe hypothermia victims requires careful protocols designed to prevent cardiac arrest and other complications that can occur when the body's core temperature is raised too quickly, and Thompson's training included extensive experience with these procedures. Both Robert Myers and Victor Cruz were showing signs of severe hypothermia, with core body temperatures estimated at less than 90 degrees Fahrenheit, requiring immediate but carefully controlled rewarming to prevent fatal complications. During the flight to Kodiak, Robert Myers began showing signs of returning consciousness, though his speech was slurred and his movements uncoordinated, typical symptoms of hypothermia recovery. His vital signs remained stable, and Thompson's assessment suggested that his prognosis for full recovery was good, assuming no complications developed during the hospital treatment phase. Victor Cruz remained unconscious throughout the flight, with vital signs that were significantly more compromised than those of his crewmate. His breathing remained shallow and irregular. His pulse was weak and irregular, and his skin continued to show the grey pallor that indicated severe hypothermia. Thompson's assessment was more guarded, with Cruz requiring immediate advance medical intervention to prevent fatal complications. The helicopter landed at Providence Kodiak Island Medical Center at 3:07 p.m., where trauma teams led by Dr. Patricia Ann Williams, the hospital's emergency department director, were prepared to provide the specialized care that hypothermia victims required. Dr. Williams, a 42-year-old emergency physician with extensive experience treating cold water immersion cases, had assembled a team that included specialists in hypothermia treatment, cardiac care, and intensive care medicine. Robert Myers was transferred directly to the emergency department's trauma bay, where Dr. Williams and her team began the careful rewarming process that would gradually restore his core body temperature while monitoring for cardiac complications and other problems that commonly occurred during hypothermia recovery. His initial assessment revealed a core body temperature of 87 degrees Fahrenheit, severe dehydration, and early signs of frostbite on his extremities. But his overall condition was stable enough to suggest a good prognosis for full recovery. Victor Cruz's condition was significantly more critical, with a core body temperature of 84 degrees Fahrenheit and vital signs that indicated severe cardiovascular compromise. Dr. Williams immediately initiated advanced rewarming procedures while preparing for possible cardiac resuscitation if Cruz's condition deteriorated further. His treatment required the hospital's most sophisticated equipment and the attention of multiple specialists working in coordination to address the complex medical challenges presented by severe hypothermia. News of the Sarah's Dream tragedy began spreading through the Kodiak fishing community within hours of the rescue operation, carried by the informal communication networks that connected fishermen, harbor workers, fish processors, and the extended families whose lives revolved around the fishing industry. The initial reports were fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, but the basic facts were clear. A respected local fishing vessel had been lost with all hands, with only 2 of the 3 crew members successfully rescued. Captain Robert Myers' reputation in the fishing community ensured that news of the tragedy reached every corner of Kodiak Island within hours, with fishermen interrupting their own operations to return to port, families gathering around radios to monitor Coast Guard communications, and the entire community coming together in the kind of mutual support that marked close-knit communities facing tragedy. Robert's wife Sarah received official notification of the rescue at 3:45 p.m. when Coast Guard personnel arrived at her home to inform her that her husband had been rescued and was receiving medical treatment, but that the condition of the other crew members remained uncertain. Sarah Elizabeth Myers, who had lived through 36 years of marriage to a commercial fisherman and understood the risks that came with her husband's profession, had nonetheless never fully prepared herself for the possibility that Robert might not return from a fishing trip. The notification that he had been rescued alive was overwhelming relief, but the knowledge that crew members were missing and that Robert's vessel had been lost created a complex mixture of emotions that she struggled to process while rushing to the hospital to be with her husband. The notification of Tom Riley's family was complicated by the fact that he remained missing and that search operations were continuing, though the prospects for his survival after more than 4 hours in the frigid waters of the North Pacific were virtually non-existent. Jennifer Marie Koniag, Tom's girlfriend and the mother of their 2-year-old daughter, received the news at the elementary school where she worked as a teacher, and her immediate response was to arrange care for their daughter while joining Tom's mother Mary at the harbor, where they could monitor search operations and maintain hope for his rescue. Victor Cruz's family notification was handled through the Mexican consulate in Anchorage, which contacted his relatives in Manzanillo to inform them that Victor had been rescued but was in critical condition at a Kodiak hospital. The international nature of the notification process meant that Victor's family would not receive complete information about his condition for several more hours, creating an agonizing period of uncertainty for relatives who were thousands of miles away and unable to travel immediately to Alaska. The Coast Guard search operation for Tom Riley continued until darkness made further aerial searching impossible, with additional helicopter flights covering an expanded area around the Sarah's Dream's last known position. Surface vessels from the Coast Guard and volunteer fishing boats joined the search, but the combination of cold water, strong currents, and the time that had elapsed since the vessel's sinking made the probability of finding Tom alive virtually zero. At 8:30 p.m., more than 8 hours after the Sarah's Dream had sunk, Coast Guard officials suspended active search operations for Tom Riley, transitioning to a monitoring status that would continue to investigate any reports of debris or other evidence that might provide information about his fate. The decision to suspend active searching was made reluctantly, but the realities of cold water survival and the resources required for continued search operations made it impossible to justify additional helicopter flights when the probability of success had become negligible. The evening news broadcasts throughout Alaska featured the Sarah's Dream tragedy as their lead story, with reporters interviewing Coast Guard officials, family members, and members of the fishing community who had known the missing crew members. The story's impact extended beyond Alaska's borders, with national news services picking up the account of the unusual bear encounter that had led to the vessel's sinking and the loss of life. Wildlife biologists contacted by news organizations explained that while Kodiak bears were known to be excellent swimmers and occasionally traveled between islands, documented cases of bears boarding fishing vessels were extremely rare, with most encounters occurring when vessels were anchored near shore or when bears were attracted by fish processing activities. The behavior described by the surviving crew members was unusual enough to warrant investigation by Alaska Department of Fish and Game biologists, who would attempt to determine whether the bear involved might have been previously habituated to human activities or food sources. Dr. Patricia Williams and her medical team worked throughout the night to stabilize both survivors, with Robert Myers showing steady improvement as his core body temperature was gradually restored to normal levels. By midnight, Robert was conscious and coherent, though still suffering from exhaustion and the emotional trauma of watching his vessel sink and losing one of his crew members. His physical recovery was progressing well, with no signs of the cardiac complications or other problems that sometimes occurred during hypothermia treatment. Victor Cruz's condition remained critical throughout the night, with his medical team fighting to prevent cardiac arrest and other complications that threatened his life. His core body temperature was restored more slowly due to the severity of his hypothermia, and his cardiovascular system showed signs of the stress that prolonged cold water exposure had placed on his body. Dr. Williams and her team maintained continuous monitoring while providing supportive care designed to give Victor's body the time it needed to recover from the near-fatal trauma of his ordeal. Sarah Myers spent the night at her husband's bedside, providing the emotional support that complemented the medical care he was receiving while dealing with her own complex emotions about the tragedy that had nearly claimed his life. Robert's account of the bear encounter and the vessel's sinking was fragmentary, partly due to his physical condition and partly due to the traumatic nature of the experience, but Sarah was able to piece together enough details to understand the extraordinary sequence of events that had led to the loss of the Sarah's Dream. Jennifer Coniag and Mary Riley maintained their vigil at the harbour throughout the night, hoping against hope that additional search operations might locate Tom, despite the official suspension of active searching. Their presence at the harbour became a focal point for other community members who came to offer support and to share their own memories of Tom and his contributions to the local fishing community. The informal gathering that developed around Tom's family reflected the close-knit nature of Alaska's fishing communities, where the loss of any fisherman was felt personally by everyone whose livelihood depended on the sea. The investigation into the Sarah's Dream incident began immediately after the rescue operation was completed, with Coast Guard marine safety investigators working to document the circumstances that had led to the vessel's sinking and the loss of life. The investigation would examine factors including vessel stability, safety equipment, crew training, and the unusual wildlife encounter that had precipitated the tragedy, with the goal of determining whether any regulatory changes or safety improvements might prevent similar incidents in the future. The emergency beacon that had enabled the rescue of Robert Myers and Victor Cruz continued transmitting from the seafloor where it had sunk with the Sarah's Dream, providing investigators with precise coordinates for the vessel's final position. Plans were already being made for an underwater investigation that would use remotely operated vehicles to examine the wreckage and potentially recover additional evidence about the sequence of events that had led to the vessel's loss. As dawn broke over Kodiak Island on October 4th, the fishing community was beginning to come to terms with the loss of the Sarah's Dream and the presumed death of Tom Riley, while celebrating the miraculous survival of Robert Myers and holding hope for Victor Cruz's recovery. The tragedy had reminded everyone involved in Alaska's fishing industry of the risks they faced every time they left port, while also demonstrating the effectiveness of emergency equipment and rescue operations when disaster struck in one of the world's most challenging maritime environments. Robert Myers was transferred from the emergency department to a regular hospital room on the morning of October 4th, his condition having stabilized sufficiently to no longer require intensive monitoring. His recovery was progressing well, with his core body temperature fully restored and no signs of lasting physical damage from his ordeal in the frigid waters. However, the emotional trauma of losing his vessel and crew member was clearly evident, and hospital social workers were providing counseling support to help him process the psychological impact of the experience. Victor Cruz remained in critical condition, though his medical team was cautiously optimistic about his prospects for recovery. His core body temperature had been successfully restored, and his cardiovascular system was showing signs of stabilization, but he remained unconscious and would require several more days of intensive medical care before his prognosis could be determined with confidence. His family in Mexico had been contacted with updates on his condition, and arrangements were being made for relatives to travel to Alaska if his condition permitted visits. The search for Tom Riley's body continued on an informal basis, with fishing vessels working in the area, keeping watch for any sign of debris or other evidence that might provide information about his fate. The strong currents and cold water temperatures meant that his body might never be recovered, a reality that his family was slowly beginning to accept, while maintaining hope that closure might eventually be possible. The media attention generated by the unusual circumstances of the Sarah's Dream tragedy continued to grow, with wildlife documentarians and marine biologists expressing interest in the case as an example of the complex interactions between human activities and wildlife in Alaska's coastal waters. The bear encounter that had led to the vessel's sinking was being studied as a potentially unprecedented event that might provide insights into bear behavior and the need for additional safety protocols for fishing vessels operating in waters frequented by large marine mammals and swimming bears. Insurance investigators representing the companies that had covered the Sarah's Dream and her crew were beginning their own investigation into the incident, focusing on the vessel's seaworthiness, safety equipment, and the circumstances that had led to its loss. The unusual nature of the cause, a bear boarding the vessel, was creating challenges for investigators accustomed to dealing with more conventional maritime accidents such as equipment failures, weather-related incidents, or human error. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game announced that it would conduct its own investigation into the bear encounter, focusing on whether the animal involved might have been previously habituated to human activities or food sources that could explain its unusual behavior. Biologists noted that while Kodiak bears were known to be opportunistic feeders and excellent swimmers, documented cases of bears boarding fishing vessels were extremely rare, making this incident worthy of scientific study. Robert Meyer's first coherent interview with investigators took place on the afternoon of October 4th, when he was able to provide a detailed account of the events leading up to the Sarah's Dream's sinking. His description of the bear's approach and boarding of the vessel confirmed the unusual nature of the incident, while his account of the vessel's rapid loss of stability provided important information for maritime safety investigators studying the sequence of events. According to Robert's account, the bear had approached their vessel with what appeared to be deliberate intent, swimming directly toward them rather than simply crossing their path, as might be expected if the animal had been traveling between islands for normal foraging purposes. The bear's ability to board their vessel and the catastrophic impact of its weight on the boat's stability had created a situation that no amount of crew training or safety equipment could have prevented, highlighting the unique challenges faced by fishermen working in waters inhabited by large, potentially dangerous wildlife. The Coast Guard's preliminary investigation findings, released on October 5th, concluded that the Sarah's Dream had been operated in accordance with all applicable safety regulations and that the crew had responded appropriately to the emergency situation created by the bear's presence on their vessel. The investigation noted that the vessel's rapid capsizing had been caused by factors beyond the crew's control and that the survival of 2 of the 3 crew members was largely due to the effectiveness of their life jackets and the quick response of Coast Guard rescue personnel. Victor Cruz regained consciousness on the morning of October 6th, 3 days after his rescue from the North Pacific, though his recovery would require several more weeks of hospitalization and rehabilitation. His first words upon awakening were questions about the fate of his crewmates, and learning about Tom Riley's presumed death created additional emotional trauma that complicated his physical recovery. However, his medical team was optimistic about his long-term prognosis, with no signs of permanent damage from his prolonged exposure to hypothermic conditions. The fishing community's support for the families affected by the Sarah's Dream tragedy was demonstrated through a variety of fundraising efforts and volunteer activities designed to help with medical expenses, funeral costs, and the financial hardships created by the loss of income from Robert's fishing operation. A memorial fund for Tom Riley was established at the First National Bank of Alaska, with donations coming from fishermen throughout the Pacific Northwest and from other members of Alaska's maritime community who understood the risks and challenges faced by commercial fishing families. The psychological counseling services provided to Robert Myers and his family were expanded to include other community members who had been affected by the tragedy, recognizing that the loss of the Sarah's Dream had created emotional trauma that extended beyond the immediate families of the crew members. The close-knit nature of Alaska's fishing communities meant that Tom Riley's disappearance and the near death of Robert and Victor had affected hundreds of people who had known them personally or professionally. Media coverage of the incident began to focus on broader questions about the intersection of human activities and wildlife management in Alaska, with environmental groups and fishing industry representatives offering different perspectives on how such encounters might be prevented in the future. Some commentators suggested that climate change and its impact on fish populations might be forcing bears to alter their foraging behavior in ways that increased the likelihood of encounters with fishing vessels, though wildlife biologists cautioned that a single incident provided insufficient data for such conclusions. The memorial service for Tom Riley was held at the Old Harbor Community Center on October 10th, with hundreds of people attending to honor a young man whose life had been cut short while supporting his family through one of Alaska's most dangerous professions. The service featured speakers from the fishing community, tribal elders who had known Tom's family for generations, and representatives from the Coast Guard rescue team that had attempted to locate him during the search operations that followed the Sarah's Dream's sinking. Jennifer Koniag spoke movingly about Tom's dedication to his family and his pride in carrying on the fishing traditions that his ancestors had practiced for thousands of years, while also acknowledging the modern economic realities that had required him to adapt those traditions to commercial fishing operations. Her remarks highlighted the complex cultural and economic factors that shaped the lives of Alaska Native fishermen, who found themselves navigating between traditional ways of life and the demands of modern commercial fishing. Robert Myers was discharged from the hospital on October 12th, 9 days after his rescue, though his recovery would continue for several more months as he dealt with the physical and emotional aftereffects of his ordeal. His wife Sarah had arranged for counseling services to help him process the trauma of losing his vessel and crew member, recognizing that the psychological impact of the incident might be more lasting than his physical injuries. The question of whether Robert would return to fishing remained unresolved, with family members and friends offering different perspectives on whether he should risk another tragedy by continuing in a profession that had nearly claimed his life. Sarah Myers was supportive of whatever decision her husband made, while acknowledging that the financial pressures facing their family might require him to continue working despite the emotional trauma of the Sarah's Dream incident. Victor Cruz's recovery progressed steadily through October, though his plans for the future were complicated by the loss of his employment aboard the Sarah's Dream and the need to find alternative sources of income to support his family in Mexico. His medical expenses were being covered by a combination of insurance and community fundraising efforts, but the long-term financial impact of his injury and the loss of his fishing income created additional stress during his recovery period. The underwater investigation of the Sarah's Dream wreckage was conducted in late October using a remotely operated vehicle deployed from a Coast Guard cutter, revealing that the vessel had sunk in 420 feet of water and had come to rest upright on the seafloor. The examination of the wreckage confirmed that the vessel's loss had been caused by flooding through the rail and scuppers as a result of the extreme list created by the bear's presence, rather than any structural failure or other mechanical problem. The ROV investigation also located personal items and equipment that had belonged to the crew, though no trace of Tom Riley's body was found in or around the wreckage. The strong currents in the area and the time that had elapsed since the sinking made it unlikely that his remains would ever be recovered, a reality that his family was slowly accepting while working to find closure in other ways. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game's investigation into the bear encounter concluded that the animal's behavior, while highly unusual, was not necessarily indicative of habituation to human activities or food sources. Biologists noted that Kodiak bears were intelligent, adaptable predators capable of learning new behaviors when presented with novel situations, and that the bear involved might have been investigating the fishing vessel out of curiosity rather than aggressive intent. However, the investigation also revealed that there had been increased bear activity in the waters around Kodiak Island during the weeks preceding the Sarah's Dream incident, possibly related to salmon runs and other natural food sources that might have brought bears into closer contact with fishing operations. The department recommended that fishermen working in the area maintain increased vigilance for swimming bears and consider additional safety precautions when operating in waters where such encounters might be possible. The insurance settlement for the Sarah's Dream was completed in November 2025, with Robert Myers receiving compensation for the loss of his vessel, equipment and fishing income, though the amount was insufficient to immediately replace the boat and resume fishing operations. The settlement provided some financial security for Robert and Sarah while they decided whether to continue in the fishing business or pursue alternative careers that might be less dangerous. Victor Cruz returned to Mexico in December 2025 to continue his recovery with his family, though he maintained contact with the Kodiak fishing community and expressed hope that he might eventually return to Alaska for future fishing seasons. His experience aboard the Sarah's Dream had deepened his appreciation for both the opportunities and the dangers that Alaska fishing offered to men like himself who were willing to risk their lives in pursuit of economic success. The first anniversary of the Sarah's Dream tragedy was marked by a memorial gathering at Larsen Bay, where family members, friends, and other fishermen gathered to remember Tom Riley and to celebrate the survival of Robert Myers and Victor Cruz. The event served as both a memorial for the lost and a reminder of the risks that continued to face everyone involved in Alaska's fishing industry, while also honoring the traditions and community bonds that sustained fishing families through both triumphs and tragedies. Robert Myers spoke briefly at the memorial gathering, expressing his gratitude to the Coast Guard personnel who had saved his life and his determination to ensure that Tom Riley's memory would be honored through continued support for his daughter and family. Robert's remarks also included a commitment to share his experience with other fishermen, hoping that increased awareness of the potential for wildlife encounters might help prevent similar tragedies in the future. The long-term impact of the Sarah's Dream tragedy extended beyond the immediate families affected, influencing safety discussions throughout Alaska's fishing industry and contributing to new protocols for vessels operating in waters where encounters with large marine mammals or swimming bears might be possible. While such encounters remained extremely rare, the dramatic nature of the incident and its tragic consequences served as a powerful reminder of the unpredictable dangers that fishermen faced in Alaska's wilderness waters. The Kodiak bear that had caused the Sarah's Dream sinking was never definitively identified, though wildlife biologists continued to monitor bear populations in the area for any signs of animals that might have become habituated to human activities or shown unusual behavior around fishing vessels. The incident remained unique in the scientific literature as a documented case of a large bear boarding and sinking a fishing vessel, contributing to research on human-wildlife interactions in marine environments. As the second fishing season following the Sarah's Dream tragedy approached in the spring of 2026, the Alaska fishing community continued to grapple with the lessons learned from the incident, while maintaining the determination to continue practicing the profession that had sustained their families for generations. The tragedy had reminded everyone involved that the ocean's power extended beyond weather and waves to include the wildlife that shared their working environment, requiring constant vigilance and respect for all the forces that could transform a routine fishing day into a fight for survival. The memory of Tom Riley lived on in the scholarship fund established in his name to help other young Alaska Native fishermen acquire the training and equipment necessary to succeed in commercial fishing while maintaining connections to their traditional cultures and communities. The fund represented both a memorial to Tom's life and a commitment to ensuring that future generations of Alaska fishermen would be better prepared for the challenges they would face in pursuing their livelihood from the sea. Robert Myers eventually decided to return to fishing, purchasing a new vessel in the summer of 2026, though his approach to fishing had been forever changed by his experience aboard the Sarah's Dream. The new boat, a 32-foot vessel he named Second Chance, incorporated additional safety features, including enhanced communications equipment, upgraded flotation systems, and protocols specifically designed to address wildlife encounters that might threaten vessel stability. Sarah Myers had initially opposed her husband's decision to return to fishing, fearing that another tragedy might claim his life and leave their family without a husband and father. However, she gradually came to understand that fishing was not simply Robert's profession, but an integral part of his identity, and that forcing him to abandon the sea might cause psychological damage that could be as devastating as any physical injury. Her support for his return to fishing came with conditions, including regular check-ins via satellite communication, modified fishing practices that prioritized safety over maximum catch, and a commitment to retire from fishing when he reached 65 years of age. The design and construction of the Second Chance reflected lessons learned from the Sarah's Dream tragedy, with naval architects and marine engineers consulted to ensure that the vessel would maintain stability even if subjected to unexpected weight distribution changes. The boat featured a lower center of gravity, wider beam, and compartmentalized flotation systems that would prevent rapid sinking even if the hull was breached. Wildlife deterrent systems, including air horns and flare guns, were installed to discourage bears or other large marine animals from approaching the vessel. Victor Cruz's recovery in Mexico progressed slowly but steadily through the winter of 2025 to 2026. Though the physical and psychological trauma of his near-death experience in the North Pacific continued to affect his daily life. The hypothermia and prolonged cold water exposure had left him with circulatory problems in his extremities, while the emotional trauma of watching Tom Riley disappear beneath the waves created nightmares and anxiety that required ongoing counseling and medical treatment. Despite these challenges, Victor maintained his determination to return to Alaska for the 2026 fishing season, driven partly by financial necessity and partly by a refusal to allow the Sarah's Dream tragedy to end his fishing career. His family in Manzanillo had struggled financially during his absence, and the medical expenses associated with his treatment had consumed much of the savings he had accumulated during his years of Alaska fishing. The reunion between Robert Myers and Victor Cruz in Kodiak during May 2026 was emotional and complex, with both men still processing the trauma of their shared experience while attempting to rebuild their professional relationship under radically different circumstances. The loss of Tom Riley created a void in their crew that could never be completely filled, while the memory of the bear encounter and the sinking of the Sarah's Dream influenced every decision they made about fishing operations and safety procedures. Robert's decision to offer Victor a position aboard the Second Chance was motivated partly by loyalty to a crew member who had saved his life, and partly by recognition that Victor's experience and skills made him invaluable despite the emotional complications created by their shared trauma. Victor's acceptance of the position reflected both his need for income and his belief that facing his fears by returning to the same waters where he had nearly died was essential for his psychological recovery. The new crew configuration for the Second Chance included a third crew member, James Patrick McNeil, a 26-year-old fisherman from Seward, Alaska, whose own fishing experience and stable temperament was seen as essential for creating a crew dynamic that could function effectively despite the psychological challenges faced by Robert and Victor. James had been recommended by other fishing captains who recognized the delicate nature of crew relationships aboard a vessel where two of the three crew members were survivors of a traumatic accident. James Patrick McNeil, born in Seward on September 14, 1999, had grown up in a fishing family but had chosen to pursue a college education before entering the commercial fishing industry, earning a degree in marine biology from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, before deciding that his future lay aboard fishing vessels rather than in research laboratories. His scientific background provided valuable insights into fish behavior and marine ecosystems, while his lack of direct involvement in the Sarah's Dream tragedy allowed him to provide emotional stability for Robert and Victor as they worked to rebuild their fishing operation. The 2026 fishing season aboard the Second Chance began with modified protocols designed to prevent the kind of wildlife encounter that had destroyed the Sarah's Dream, including constant monitoring of surrounding waters for swimming bears or other large marine animals, maintained radio contact with other vessels in the area, and predetermined procedures for responding to wildlife approaches. The crew conducted regular safety drills that specifically addressed wildlife encounters, emergency abandoned ship procedures, and cold water survival techniques. Despite these precautions, the psychological impact of the Sarah's Dream tragedy continued to influence every aspect of their fishing operations, with Robert, Victor, and James all experiencing heightened anxiety whenever they encountered any unusual wildlife activity or unexpected changes in water conditions. The sight of seals, sea lions, or whales in the vicinity of their vessel created tension that took considerable time to dissipate, while any floating debris or unusual water disturbances triggered immediate concern about potential bear encounters. The first successful fishing trip aboard the Second Chance occurred in late May 2026, when the crew located a productive salmon concentration in waters approximately 8 miles from the site where the Sarah's Dream had been lost. The psychological challenge of fishing in the same general area where Tom Riley had died, and where Robert and Victor had nearly lost their own lives, was substantial. But the economic necessity of pursuing fish wherever they could be found required them to overcome their fears and focus on their professional responsibilities. The fishing success during that first trip was modest compared to the exceptional catches that the Sarah's Dream had sometimes achieved. But the psychological victory of completing a successful fishing operation without incident was more valuable than any financial gain. The crew's confidence began to build gradually as they accumulated experience aboard the Second Chance and developed working relationships that accommodated the emotional challenges created by their shared history. Robert's relationship with his wife Sarah continued to evolve throughout the 2026 fishing season, with both partners learning to navigate the complex emotions created by his return to the profession that had nearly claimed his life. Sarah's anxiety about Robert's safety was balanced by her recognition that fishing was essential to his sense of identity and purpose, while Robert's gratitude for surviving the Sarah's Dream tragedy was tempered by guilt about Tom Riley's death and responsibility for Victor's ongoing medical problems. The fishing community's response to Robert's return was overwhelmingly supportive, with other captains sharing information about productive fishing areas, offering assistance with equipment and supplies, and maintaining the kind of informal safety network that helped protect all fishermen working in Alaska's dangerous waters. The tragedy of the Sarah's Dream had reminded everyone in the community of their mutual vulnerability and interdependence, strengthening the bonds that connected fishing families and crews throughout the region. Victor's adaptation to life aboard the Second Chance was complicated by physical limitations resulting from his hypothermia experience and ongoing psychological challenges related to the trauma of nearly drowning in the North Pacific. His circulation problems made it difficult for him to work effectively in cold conditions, while his anxiety about water safety required constant management through breathing exercises, meditation techniques, and regular communication with counselors who specialized in trauma recovery. Despite these challenges, Victor's fishing skills and knowledge of local waters remained exceptional, making him a valuable crew member whose contributions to the Second Chance's success extended far beyond his physical abilities. His insights into fish behavior, weather patterns, and equipment operation were based on decades of experience that couldn't be replaced, while his determination to overcome the psychological effects of the Sarah's Dream tragedy served as inspiration for other crew members dealing with their own emotional challenges. The investigation into the Sarah's Dream incident was officially closed in September 2026, with the final report concluding that the tragedy had been caused by an extraordinarily rare wildlife encounter that could not have been prevented through any reasonable safety measures available to commercial fishing vessels. The report's recommendations focused on improved wildlife awareness training for fishing crews, enhanced communication systems for reporting unusual wildlife activity, and continued research into human-wildlife interactions in marine environments. The legal proceedings related to the Sarah's Dream tragedy were minimal, as the investigation had established that no human error or equipment failure had contributed to the vessel's loss. However, the families affected by the incident pursued civil litigation against insurance companies and equipment manufacturers, seeking compensation for medical expenses, lost income, and the ongoing psychological effects of the trauma experienced by the survivors. Tom Riley's family received a settlement from the vessel's insurance company that provided financial support for his daughter Sophia's education and care, though no amount of money could compensate for the loss of a father and provider whose death had created emotional trauma that would affect his family for generations. Jennifer Koniag eventually relocated to Anchorage with Sophia, seeking employment opportunities and educational resources that were not available in the small community of Old Harbor. The scholarship fund, established in Tom Riley's memory, continued to grow throughout 2026 and beyond, supporting young Alaska Native fishermen who were working to balance traditional cultural values with the economic realities of modern commercial fishing. The fund reflected the community's determination to ensure that Tom's death would contribute to positive changes that might prevent similar tragedies while honoring the cultural heritage that he had represented. Robert Meyer's decision to limit his fishing operations to daylight hours and nearshore waters represented a significant change from the aggressive fishing strategies that had made the Sarah's Dream one of the most successful vessels in the Kodiak fleet. The modified approach reduced his earning potential, but reflected his new priorities, which emphasized safety and family considerations over maximum profit. The psychological counseling services that Robert, Victor, and their families received continued for more than 2 years after the Sarah's Dream tragedy, addressing not only the immediate trauma of the incident, but also the long-term effects of survivors' guilt, anxiety disorders, and the complex emotions associated with returning to a profession that had nearly claimed their lives. The counseling services were supported by both insurance coverage and community fundraising, reflecting the fishing community's recognition that mental health support was as important as physical safety equipment. Victor's relationship with his family in Mexico was strengthened by his near-death experience, leading to more frequent communication and a deeper appreciation for the relationships that had sustained him throughout his fishing career. His medical expenses had created financial hardship for his extended family, but the support he received from the Alaska fishing community had demonstrated the value of the relationships he had built during his years working in Alaska waters. The bear population monitoring conducted by Alaska Department of Fish and Game biologists in the waters around Kodiak Island revealed no unusual patterns of behavior that might have predicted the Sarah's Dream encounter, reinforcing the conclusion that the incident had been an extraordinary and unpredictable event. However, the monitoring program was expanded to include more systematic tracking of bear movements in marine environments, contributing to scientific understanding of these magnificent predators and their interactions with human activities. The media attention generated by the Sarah's Dream tragedy gradually diminished as other news stories captured public attention, but the incident continued to be studied by maritime safety experts, wildlife biologists, and trauma counselors who were interested in its implications for their respective fields. The extraordinary nature of the bear encounter and the survival of 2 crew members provided valuable case study material for understanding human responses to extreme stress and life-threatening situations. The Second Chances fishing operations during 2026 proved successful enough to provide financial stability for Robert's family and employment income for Victor and James, though the psychological challenges faced by the crew continued to influence their efficiency and decision-making processes. The vessel's safety equipment and protocols were constantly updated based on lessons learned from each fishing trip, creating an evolving system designed to prevent the kind of catastrophic loss that had claimed the Sarah's Dream. The anniversary of Tom Riley's death was marked each year with memorial services and community gatherings that celebrated his life while acknowledging the ongoing impact of his loss on his family and the broader fishing community. These commemorative events served multiple purposes, providing opportunities for grief processing, community bonding, and safety education that helped prepare younger fishermen for the risks they would face in pursuing their chosen profession. The relationship between Robert Myers and the Coast Guard personnel who had rescued him remained strong, with regular communication and mutual respect that reflected their shared understanding of the life and death challenges faced by those who worked on Alaska's waters. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell and her rescue crew were recognized for their professionalism and skill in conducting the rescue operation under difficult conditions, receiving commendations that acknowledged their contribution to saving lives in one of the world's most challenging rescue environments. The fishing industry's response to the Sarah's Dream tragedy included enhanced safety training programs that specifically addressed wildlife encounters and their potential impact on vessel stability and crew safety. These programs were developed collaboratively by fishing industry organizations, Coast Guard safety specialists, and wildlife biologists, creating educational resources that could help prevent similar incidents while acknowledging that some risks were inherent in fishing operations conducted in Alaska's wild marine environment. Victor Cruz's decision to continue fishing despite his traumatic experience reflected both his economic needs and his determination to overcome the psychological effects of nearly dying in the North Pacific. His courage in returning to the same waters where he had almost lost his life served as inspiration for other trauma survivors who were struggling to rebuild their lives after life-threatening experiences. The technological improvements incorporated into the Second Chance represented significant advances in fishing vessel safety, with systems designed specifically to address the lessons learned from the Sarah's Dream tragedy. These improvements included automated distress beacon activation, enhanced flotation systems, improved hypothermia protection equipment, and communication systems that provided real-time contact with rescue services even in remote waters. The economic impact of the Sarah's Dream tragedy extended beyond the immediate families affected, influencing insurance rates, safety equipment requirements, and operating procedures throughout Alaska's fishing industry. While the financial costs were substantial, the fishing community's response demonstrated the resilience and mutual support that had sustained these communities through generations of maritime challenges and tragedies. The scientific research conducted in response to the bear encounter provided valuable insights into the behavior of Kodiak bears in marine environments, contributing to conservation efforts and wildlife management strategies throughout Alaska. The research findings were published in scientific journals and presented at academic conferences, ensuring that the knowledge gained from this tragic incident would contribute to broader understanding of human-wildlife interactions in marine ecosystems. Robert Meyer's eventual retirement from fishing in 2030, at the age of 68, marked the end of a career that had spanned 4 decades and included experiences that few fishermen could imagine surviving. His decision to retire was influenced by the physical effects of aging, the emotional toll of the Sarah's Dream tragedy, and his desire to spend his remaining years with his family rather than continuing to risk his life in pursuit of economic gain. The legacy of the Sarah's Dream tragedy continued to influence Alaska's fishing industry for years after the incident, serving as a reminder of the unpredictable dangers that fishermen faced and the importance of safety equipment, training, and community support in helping crews survive when disaster struck. The lessons learned from the tragedy contributed to improved safety protocols, better emergency response procedures, and enhanced understanding of the complex relationships between human activities and wildlife in Alaska's marine environment. Victor Cruz's return to Mexico in 2031, after 14 years of Alaska fishing, represented the conclusion of a remarkable journey that had taken him from the warm waters of the Pacific coast to the frigid and dangerous seas around Kodiak Island. His experiences aboard the Sarah's Dream and the Second Chance had transformed him from a young Mexican fisherman seeking economic opportunity into a mature man whose survival of a near-death experience had given him perspective on life's priorities and the importance of family, community, and personal resilience. The memorial erected at Larsen Bay in Tom Riley's honor served as a permanent reminder of the risks faced by Alaska's fishermen and the tragic loss of a young man whose life had been cut short while pursuing the profession that had sustained his family for generations. The memorial's inscription, written in both English and Alutiiq, reflected Tom's cultural heritage and his role as a bridge between traditional and modern Alutiiq culture, Alaska native fishing practices, and modern commercial fishing operations. The story of the Sarah's Dream became part of Alaska fishing folklore, passed down through generations of fishermen as both a cautionary tale about the unpredictable dangers of their profession and an inspiring account of survival against overwhelming odds. The extraordinary nature of the bear encounter and the dramatic rescue operation ensured that the incident would be remembered long after the individuals involved had passed away, serving as a reminder of the power of nature and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. The children and grandchildren of the Sarah's Dreams crew members would grow up hearing stories about the tragedy and its aftermath, learning lessons about courage, community support, and the importance of family that would influence their own decisions about careers, relationships, and life priorities. The incident's impact extended far beyond the immediate participants, affecting entire communities and generations of Alaska residents whose lives were connected to the fishing industry and its inherent risks and rewards. The final chapter of the Sarah's Dream story was written not in the dramatic moments of the bear encounter and vessel sinking, but in the years that followed, as survivors, families, and communities worked to heal from trauma, rebuild their lives, and honor the memory of those who had been lost. The tragedy's true legacy lay not in the destruction it had caused, but in the resilience, compassion, and determination that had emerged from the wreckage, demonstrating the extraordinary capacity of human beings to survive, adapt, and find meaning even in the face of the most devastating losses. The next stories, Polar Bear Devours 19-year-old student in Canada. Within 5 minutes, January 12, 2025, the Arctic wind howled across the frozen tundra of Churchill, Manitoba, carrying with it the scent of death that would soon permeate the small research cabin designated as Station Delta 7. At precisely 11:47 p.m. on January 12, 2025, the temperature had plummeted to -42 degrees Celsius, and the aurora borealis painted the star-filled sky in ethereal greens and blues that would be the last beautiful thing Emily Rose Carter would ever see. The 19-year-old marine biology student from the University of Manitoba had no way of knowing that in exactly 13 minutes her life would end in the most horrific way imaginable, torn apart by 800 pounds of apex predator whose massive claws would shred through her ribcage like tissue paper while her screams echoed across the desolate wilderness. Emily Carter had been born on a warm summer day in Winnipeg on June 15, 2005, to Dr. Margaret Carter, a respected pediatric surgeon at the Health Sciences Centre, and Professor James Carter, who taught environmental science at the University of Manitoba. From her earliest childhood memories, Emily had been fascinated by marine life, spending countless hours at the Assiniboine Park Zoo studying the polar bear exhibit. Pressing her small hands against the glass while the massive white bears swam gracefully through their artificial Arctic habitat. Her parents had encouraged this passion, taking her on annual trips to Churchill during the polar bear migration season, where she would stand safely behind the reinforced windows of tundra vehicles and watch the magnificent predators roam freely across their natural habitat. Little did any of them know that this childhood fascination would ultimately lead to her brutal demise in the very place she had come to love and respect. Growing up in the affluent Tuxedo neighborhood of Winnipeg, Emily had excelled academically throughout her primary and secondary education at Balmoral Hall School, where she graduated as valedictorian with a 98.7% average, and had been accepted into the prestigious marine biology program at the University of Manitoba with a full academic scholarship. Her thesis advisor, Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a world-renowned expert in Arctic marine ecosystems, had specifically selected Emily for this research expedition based on her exceptional academic performance and her demonstrated passion for polar bear conservation. Dr. Hendricks, a 47-year-old professor who had spent the better part of 2 decades studying the impact of climate change on polar bear populations, had been conducting this annual winter research trip for 15 years without a single serious incident, making Emily's death all the more shocking and unexpected. The research team that had arrived at the Churchill Northern Study Centre on January 8, 2025, consisted of 12 individuals, each carefully selected for their specific expertise and proven ability to work in extreme Arctic conditions. Emily Carter served as the team's marine biology research assistant, responsible for collecting and analyzing water samples from ice holes to study the microscopic organisms that formed the foundation of the Arctic food chain. Her roommates in the cramped research cabin were Michael Anthony Lopez, a 20-year-old environmental science major from Thompson, Manitoba, whose father had worked for Manitoba Hydro for 30 years, and whose mother was a Cree elder who had taught him traditional survival skills that would prove invaluable during the horrific events that were about to unfold. And Sarah Michelle Kim, a 21-year-old zoology student from Vancouver whose parents had immigrated from South Korea in 1995 and had built a successful restaurant chain across British Columbia before encouraging their daughter to pursue her dream of becoming a wildlife veterinarian. Michael Lopez stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with broad shoulders and calloused hands that spoke to his upbringing in the rugged northern Manitoba wilderness, where he had learned to hunt, fish, and survive in conditions that would kill most people within hours. His great-grandfather had been a legendary trapper who had once survived 3 weeks alone on the tundra after his dog team had been killed by wolves, and Michael carried that legacy of toughness and resourcefulness in his DNA. He had volunteered for this research expedition partly because he needed the academic credits, but mostly because he felt a deep spiritual connection to the land that his ancestors had called home for thousands of years. His jet-black hair was typically braided in the traditional style his grandmother had taught him, and his dark eyes held a wisdom and awareness of natural dangers that came from growing up in a place where nature was both beautiful and deadly. Sarah Kim, by contrast, was a petite young woman standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulder-length black hair that she kept meticulously styled even in the harsh conditions of the Arctic Research Station. She had grown up in the urban environment of Vancouver, where her closest encounter with wildlife had been feeding ducks at Queen Elizabeth Park, making her participation in this Arctic research expedition both brave and somewhat naive. Her parents, Dr. Jin-Ho Kim and Mrs. Hye-Jin Kim, had initially been reluctant to allow their daughter to participate in what they considered a dangerous expedition to the middle of nowhere. But Sarah had convinced them that the experience would be invaluable for her application to veterinary school at the University of Saskatchewan. She carried with her a digital camera that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, hoping to document the expedition for her senior thesis on the behavioral patterns of Arctic wildlife. The research cabin that would become Emily's tomb had been constructed in 1987 as part of the Churchill Northern Study Centre's expansion into long-term field research capabilities. Station Delta 7 sat approximately 18 kilometers northeast of Churchill proper, positioned strategically near the intersection of 3 major polar bear migration routes that had been used by the massive predators for centuries. The cabin itself measured 24 feet by 36 feet, with walls constructed from 8-inch thick logs harvested from the boreal forest south of Churchill and chinked with a modern synthetic compound designed to withstand the extreme temperature fluctuations of the subarctic environment. The foundation consisted of reinforced concrete piers that elevated the structure 3 feet above the permafrost, allowing Arctic winds to flow underneath and prevent the gradual melting that had destroyed previous research stations. Inside the cabin, the layout was Spartanly functional, designed to accommodate 6 researchers in relative comfort during extended winter deployments. The main room contained a wood-burning stove that served as the primary heat source, surrounded by a semicircle of simple wooden chairs where the research team would gather each evening to discuss their findings and plan the next day's activities. Along the eastern wall, a rudimentary kitchen area contained a propane-powered refrigerator, a two-burner camp stove, and cabinets stocked with non-perishable foods that could sustain the team for up to 6 weeks if weather conditions prevented regular supply runs from Churchill. The sleeping quarters consisted of 3 separate rooms, each containing 2 sets of military surplus bunk beds, with sleeping bags rated for temperatures as low as -50 degrees Celsius. The windows of Station Delta 7 had been installed according to 1987 building codes, which seemed adequate at the time, but would prove tragically insufficient when tested against the full force of an adult male polar bear's determination to reach the human prey inside. Each window consisted of 2 panes of standard residential glass in wooden frames, with simple sliding locks that were designed to keep out wind and cold rather than 800-pound predators. The largest window, facing south toward Hudson Bay, measured 4 feet wide by 3 feet tall and was positioned in the main room where the research team spent most of their waking hours. This window would become the entry point through which death would arrive with shocking suddenness and overwhelming violence. Dr. Patricia Hendricks had established strict protocols for polar bear safety based on her 15 years of experience conducting research in Churchill's polar bear territory. These protocols included mandatory radio check-ins every 4 hours with the Churchill Northern Studies Center, the installation of motion-activated floodlights around the cabin's perimeter, and the storage of all food in bear-proof containers located in a separate cache building 50 meters from the main cabin. Each member of the research team carried a handheld air horn and pepper spray, though Dr. Hendricks had emphasized during their safety briefing that these deterrents were largely psychological comfort measures that would be useless against a truly determined polar bear. The cabin was also equipped with a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with rubber bullets for non-lethal bear deterrence, though the weapon had never been fired in the station's 38-year history. The polar bear that would ultimately kill Emily Carter had been designated as Bear 347 in the extensive database maintained by Polar Bears International, the leading research organization dedicated to polar bear conservation and monitoring. Bear 347 was an adult male, approximately 12 years old, with a distinctive L-shaped scar on his left shoulder that had been photographed and documented during previous research seasons. At his last official weighing in October 2024, Bear 347 had tipped the scales at 847 pounds, making him one of the larger specimens in the Churchill population and certainly capable of the devastating violence that was about to unfold. His massive paws measured nearly 12 inches in diameter, with claws that extended 4 inches beyond his toe pads and were kept razor-sharp by constant use on ice and frozen ground. Bear 347's behavioral patterns had been tracked extensively by researchers over the previous 5 years, and his data profile revealed a concerning trend toward increasingly aggressive interactions with human presence in his territory. In September 2022, he had been tranquilized and relocated after destroying a research camp near Cape Churchill, and in November 2023, he had been observed stalking a group of tourists near the Tundra Lodge, behavior that was unusual for polar bears, who typically avoided human contact unless they were desperately hungry or protecting cubs. Dr. Amanda Richardson, the lead researcher for Polar Bears International, had flagged Bear 347 as a high-risk individual in her annual report, noting that his increasing boldness around human settlements suggested he might eventually attempt a direct attack on people rather than simply raiding their supplies. The events leading to Emily's death had begun innocuously enough at 6:30 a.m. on January 12th, when the research team had awakened to crystal clear skies and relatively mild temperatures of -28 degrees Celsius. Dr. Hendricks had announced over breakfast that conditions were perfect for their planned ice core sampling expedition to a site approximately 5 kilometers northeast of the cabin, where previous research had indicated the presence of unique microbial communities that might provide insights into how Arctic ecosystems were adapting to climate change. The team had spent the morning loading their equipment onto 2 snowmobiles, with Emily expressing particular excitement about the opportunity to collect samples from a location that had never been studied by marine biologists. Emily had volunteered to remain at the cabin that evening to catalogue and prepare the ice samples they had collected, while most of the team travelled back to the main research centre in Churchill for a video conference with their colleagues at the University of Manitoba. Michael Lopez and Sarah Kim had also opted to stay behind. Michael because he wanted to photograph the aurora that was predicted to be particularly spectacular that night, and Sarah because she was feeling slightly under the weather and preferred to rest in the warmth of the cabin rather than make the 45-minute snowmobile journey through the frigid darkness. Dr. Hendricks had reluctantly agreed to this arrangement, though she had emphasized the importance of following all safety protocols and maintaining regular radio contact throughout the night. At approximately 4:30 p.m., as the brief Arctic daylight began to fade into the blue-black twilight that would dominate the landscape for the next 16 hours, Bear 347 had emerged from his temporary day bed in a cluster of stunted spruce trees, roughly 2 kilometers southwest of Station Delta 7. His movements had been captured by a motion-activated wildlife camera that was part of an ongoing population monitoring study, and the timestamp on the photographs would later help investigators reconstruct the precise timeline of events leading to Emily's death. The bear appeared alert and purposeful in these images, his massive head raised to test the wind currents that were carrying the scent of human activity from the direction of the research cabin. Polar bears possess olfactory capabilities that are among the most sophisticated in the animal kingdom, with the ability to detect scents across distances of up to 20 kilometers under ideal conditions. Bear 347's sense of smell was particularly acute, honed by years of hunting seals across the vast expanse of Hudson Bay's seasonal ice cover, and the complex mixture of human odors, cooking food, and unfamiliar equipment emanating from Station Delta 7 would have been as obvious to him as a neon sign would be to a human observer. The bear's behavioral response to these scents suggested a level of curiosity and determination that was highly unusual for polar bears in the Churchill area, most of whom had learned to associate human presence with danger and typically avoided direct confrontation. As Bear 347 began his methodical approach toward the research cabin, covering the distance with the deceptively fluid gait that allowed polar bears to move silently across ice and snow despite their massive size, the 3 students inside Station Delta 7 were settling into what they expected to be a quiet evening of scientific work and casual conversation. Emily had spread her ice samples across the main table and was carefully labeling specimen containers while making detailed notes in her research journal, occasionally pausing to take photographs of particularly interesting samples with her digital camera. Michael had set up his camera equipment near the south window, testing different settings in preparation for the aurora photography session he planned to begin once full darkness had fallen. Sarah Kim had claimed one of the wooden chairs near the wood-burning stove and was reading a paperback novel she had brought from home, periodically glancing up to watch her companions work and occasionally contributing to their discussion about the day's discoveries. The atmosphere inside the cabin was relaxed and collegial, with the 3 students sharing stories about their backgrounds, their academic aspirations, and their impressions of the Arctic landscape that surrounded them. None of them had any way of knowing that their movements were being observed by a predator whose patience and hunting skills had been refined by millions of years of evolution. At 7:15 p.m., Michael's radio crackled with a routine check-in call from Dr. Hendricks at the main research center. The conversation was brief and professional, with Michael reporting that all 3 students were safe and comfortable, that the cabin's heating system was functioning properly, and that they planned to maintain radio contact every 2 hours throughout the night, as prescribed by the station's safety protocols. Dr. Hendricks reminded them to keep the exterior floodlights activated and to report any unusual wildlife activity immediately. Standard instructions that seemed routine at the time, but would later be remembered with bitter irony by everyone involved in the investigation. Bear 347's approach to Station Delta 7 demonstrated the calculated patience that made polar bears such effective predators in their natural environment. Rather than approaching directly, which might have triggered the motion-activated lighting system and alerted the humans to his presence, the massive bear had circled the cabin in a gradually tightening spiral, testing wind directions and investigating potential escape routes while avoiding the sensors that controlled the exterior illumination. His tracks, which would be discovered and photographed by investigators the following morning, revealed a level of tactical thinking that was both impressive and terrifying in its implications for human safety in polar bear territory. By 9:30 p.m., Bear 347 had completed his reconnaissance of the research station and had taken up a position approximately 30 meters southeast of the cabin, concealed behind a low ridge of wind-sculpted snow that provided perfect cover while allowing him to observe the activities of the humans inside through the brightly lit windows. From this vantage point, he could see Emily moving back and forth between the main table and the kitchen area as she prepared her samples, Michael adjusting his camera equipment near the window, and Sarah reading in her chair by the stove. The bear's behavioral analysis of these humans would have been sophisticated and thorough, noting their size, their apparent physical capabilities, and their patterns of movement within the confined space of the cabin. The aurora borealis had begun to manifest at approximately 10:15 p.m., with faint green curtains of light beginning to dance across the northern sky, prompting Michael to bundle himself in his heavy winter coat and step outside to begin his photography session. This routine activity, which had been planned for hours and seemed perfectly safe given the standard precautions they had been taught, would later be identified by investigators as the trigger event that motivated Bear 347 to begin his final approach toward the cabin. The bear's reaction to seeing a human leave the protected environment of the building suggested that he had been waiting for exactly this type of opportunity, when his potential prey would be separated and vulnerable. Michael spent approximately 20 minutes outside the cabin, moving between several different positions to capture the best possible photographs of the aurora, while Emily and Sarah remained inside, watching through the windows and occasionally calling out encouragement or suggestions about camera angles. The temperature had dropped to -40 degrees, and despite his heavy winter clothing, Michael was beginning to feel the effects of prolonged exposure to the extreme cold. His fingers were becoming numb inside his insulated gloves, making it increasingly difficult to operate his camera controls with the precision required for night photography. At 10:37 p.m., he made the decision to return inside the cabin to warm up before attempting to capture more images later in the evening. As Michael stamped his feet on the wooden steps to knock the snow off his boots before entering the cabin, Bear 347 made his final approach from the southeast, moving with the silent efficiency that had allowed his species to become the Arctic's most feared predator. The bear's massive paws distributed his weight evenly across the snow surface, preventing the crunching sounds that would have alerted the humans to his presence, while his white fur provided perfect camouflage against the snow-covered landscape. His approach route had been carefully chosen to avoid the motion sensors that controlled the exterior lighting, demonstrating an understanding of human technology that was both remarkable and deeply unsettling. Inside the cabin, the three students had gathered around the wood-burning stove to warm up after Michael's photography session, sharing hot chocolate from a thermos that Emily had prepared earlier in the evening. Their conversation had turned to their plans for the remainder of the research expedition, with Emily expressing her excitement about the preliminary results of her ice sample analysis, which suggested the presence of previously unknown microorganisms that could have significant implications for understanding Arctic marine ecosystems. Michael was describing his hopes of capturing time-lapse footage of the aurora over the course of the night, while Sarah shared her growing appreciation for the stark beauty of the Arctic landscape that had initially seemed so alien and intimidating. At 11:42 p.m., Bear 347 reached the immediate perimeter of Station Delta 7, positioning himself directly beneath the large, south-facing window that provided him with an unobstructed view of the three humans inside. From this position, less than 6 feet from his intended victims, the bear could observe every detail of their movements, their behavior, and their apparent vulnerabilities. His massive head, which measured nearly 18 inches from nose to ear tips, was positioned just below the windowsill, allowing him to study his prey with the patient intensity of an apex predator that had never encountered a situation where he was not the dominant force in any confrontation. Emily Carter was sitting in the chair closest to the window, her back turned toward the glass as she faced her companions and continued her enthusiastic discussion about the potential scientific significance of her sample findings. Her position made her the most accessible target for what was about to occur, though none of the three students had any awareness of the massive predator that was studying them from mere inches away. Michael and Sarah were positioned across the room near the stove, a distance that would prove crucial for their survival in the horrific events that were about to unfold with shocking speed and overwhelming violence. The sequence of events that led to Emily's death began at exactly 11:47 p.m., when Bear 347 made the decision to attack. The bear's first action was to rear up on his hind legs, bringing his full height of nearly 9 feet to bear against the window that separated him from his prey. His massive front paws, each weighing more than 20 pounds and equipped with claws that were harder than steel, struck the window with a force that immediately shattered both panes of glass and splintered the wooden frame into pieces that scattered across the cabin's interior like shrapnel from an explosion. The sound of the window's destruction was unlike anything the three students had ever heard, a combination of breaking glass, splintering wood, and the deep, rumbling roar that erupted from Bear 347's throat as he forced his massive body through the opening he had created. Emily's first reaction was to turn toward the sound, a movement that brought her face to face with 800 pounds of apex predator, whose small, dark eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that spoke of hunger, aggression, and absolute commitment to the attack that had already begun. Michael Lopez's survival instincts, honed by his upbringing in the northern Manitoba wilderness and the traditional teachings of his Cree grandmother, kicked in with a speed that probably saved his life and Sarah's. Without conscious thought, he grabbed Sarah by the arm and pulled her toward the cabin's back door, shouting a warning to Emily, even as he recognized that it was already too late for their friend and fellow researcher. His great-grandfather's stories about encounters with dangerous wildlife had emphasized the critical importance of immediate flight in situations where fighting was not an option, and Michael's body responded to this genetic memory with movements that were both efficient and desperate. Sarah Kim's reaction to the sudden appearance of the massive polar bear was initially one of paralyzing shock, her mind struggling to process the reality of what was happening in the space of perhaps 2 seconds. Her urban upbringing had provided no preparation for this type of life or death situation, and her first impulse was to freeze in place rather than flee, a response that would have been fatal if Michael had not physically forced her toward the cabin's rear exit. As Michael dragged her across the room, she caught a glimpse of Emily rising from her chair with an expression of absolute terror on her face, and this image would haunt Sarah's nightmares for years to come. Emily Carter's final moments began as Bear 347 completed his entry through the destroyed window, his massive body filling the space that had been the cabin's main room, with a presence that was both terrifying and majestically beautiful in its raw power. The bear's initial focus was entirely on Emily, who represented the most immediate and accessible target, and his attack was swift, efficient, and utterly devastating in its violence. The first contact between predator and prey occurred when Bear 347's right front paw struck Emily across the left side of her torso, the impact lifting her completely off her feet and hurling her against the cabin's eastern wall with enough force to crack two of her ribs and cause massive internal bleeding. The sound that Emily made when she struck the wall was a combination of the air being forced from her lungs and a scream of pain and terror that cut through the Arctic night like a knife. This scream would be the last sound she would make, as Bear 347's second attack came before she could draw another breath. His massive jaws closing around her head and upper torso, with a bite force that exceeded 1,200 pounds per square inch. The bear's canine teeth, which measured nearly 3 inches in length and were designed by evolution to crush the skulls of seals, penetrated Emily's skull with an ease that spoke to the overwhelming mismatch between human fragility and polar bear power. Michael and Sarah had reached the cabin's back door when Emily's scream echoed through the night, a sound that would remain etched in their memories for the rest of their lives. Michael's hands were shaking so violently from adrenaline and terror that he had difficulty working the door's simple sliding bolt, precious seconds that could have meant the difference between life and death if Bear 347 had chosen to pursue them rather than focus entirely on his primary victim. Sarah was pressed against his back, her breathing coming in short, panicked gasps as she listened to the sounds of destruction coming from the main room behind them. The door finally opened just as Bear 347 began the feeding behavior that would end Emily's life within the next 3 minutes. Michael and Sarah tumbled out into the Arctic night, where the temperature of -42 degrees struck them with physical force that was almost as shocking as the bear attack they had just escaped. Neither of them had taken time to grab their heavy winter coats, leaving them wearing only the light indoor clothing that provided virtually no protection against the extreme cold that could kill them almost as quickly as the polar bear they had just fled. Inside Station Delta 7, Bear 347 was demonstrating the feeding behavior that had made polar bears the most feared predators in the Arctic ecosystem. His powerful jaws worked with mechanical efficiency to dismember Emily's body, starting with her head and upper torso and working systematically downward as he consumed the high-calorie human flesh that represented a rare and valuable food source in the harsh winter environment. The bear's table manners were those of a creature that had evolved to make the most of every feeding opportunity, as the Arctic environment provided few chances for wasteful consumption of available protein. The sounds emanating from the cabin during the 5 minutes of Bear 347's feeding were a combination of breaking bones, tearing flesh, and the satisfied grunting noises that polar bears make when consuming a substantial meal. These sounds carried clearly across the snow-covered landscape to where Michael and Sarah were huddled behind the cabin's propane storage shed, trying to find shelter from the wind while listening to their friend being eaten alive. The psychological trauma of this experience would require years of intensive therapy for both survivors, and neither would ever fully recover from the horror of those 5 minutes. Michael had wrapped his arms around Sarah in an attempt to share body heat and prevent them both from dying of exposure while they waited for an opportunity to flee to safety. His knowledge of traditional survival techniques taught him that their situation was desperate, as human beings could survive only minutes in these temperatures without proper protective clothing. But the presence of Bear 347 in the cabin made it impossible for them to retrieve their winter gear. The nearest shelter was the equipment cache building, located 50 meters from the main cabin, but reaching it would require crossing open ground where they would be completely vulnerable if the polar bear emerged from his feeding and decided to hunt for additional prey. Sarah was beginning to show the early signs of hypothermia, with violent shivering that made it difficult for her to speak coherently, and a growing lethargy that represented her body's attempt to conserve energy for essential functions. Michael realized that they had perhaps 10 minutes before the extreme cold would render them incapable of movement, at which point they would freeze to death regardless of whether Bear 347 decided to pursue them. The irony of their situation was not lost on him. They had escaped being killed by a polar bear, only to face death by freezing in the same Arctic environment that the bear called home. At 11:52 p.m., exactly 5 minutes after the attack had begun, Bear 347 emerged from Station Delta 7 through the same window he had used to enter, his muzzle stained with Emily's blood, and his massive frame showing the satisfaction of a predator that had successfully completed a hunt. The bear's behavior following his feeding was consistent with documented polar bear behavior patterns, as he began to investigate the area around the cabin for additional food sources or potential threats to his claim on the territory. His keen sense of smell immediately detected the presence of Michael and Sarah behind the propane shed, but rather than pursuing them immediately, he chose to mark his territory by urinating around the cabin's perimeter. Michael recognized this territorial marking behavior from his grandfather's stories about polar bear encounters, and he understood that Bear 347 was claiming the research station as his temporary domain. This territorial claim meant that the bear would likely remain in the immediate area for several hours, making it extremely dangerous for Michael and Sarah to attempt to reach the equipment cache or to try to flee across the open tundra toward Churchill. Their only option was to remain hidden and hope that someone would come looking for them when they failed to make their scheduled radio check-in at 2 a.m. The temperature continued to drop as the night progressed, reaching -45 degrees by midnight, and both Michael and Sarah were beginning to experience the advanced stages of hypothermia that would soon render them unconscious. Michael's fingers and toes had lost all sensation, and he was having increasing difficulty forming coherent thoughts as his brain began to shut down non-essential functions to conserve energy for survival. Sarah had stopped shivering, which Michael recognized as a dangerous sign, indicating that her body was no longer able to generate heat through muscle contractions. At 12:15 a.m. on January 13th, Bear 347 returned to Station Delta 7 to continue feeding on Emily's remains, a behavior that was consistent with polar bear feeding patterns, as the bears typically consume their prey over several hours, rather than eating everything at once. The sound of the bear's return to the cabin was audible to Michael and Sarah, who realized with growing despair that their window of opportunity to escape was rapidly closing as hypothermia continued to sap their strength and mental clarity. Michael made the decision to attempt to reach the emergency radio that was stored in the equipment cache, reasoning that their only hope of survival was to call for help while they still had the physical capability to operate the communication equipment. He whispered his plan to Sarah, who was barely conscious and responded only with a weak nod that indicated her understanding of their desperate situation. The 50-meter distance to the cache building might as well have been 50 kilometers given their physical condition and the presence of Bear 347 in the immediate area. At 12:30 a.m., Michael began his crawling approach toward the equipment cache, moving with the stealth techniques his great-grandfather had taught him for hunting in dangerous territory. His progress was agonizingly slow, as he had to pause frequently to rest and to listen for any indication that Bear 347 had detected his movement. The snow was hard-packed and crusted, providing some support for his weight, but also creating the potential for noise that could alert the bear to his presence. Each meter of progress required several minutes of careful movement, followed by motionless waiting to ensure he had not attracted the predator's attention. Sarah remained behind the propane shed, curled into a fetal position in an attempt to conserve body heat, while fighting against the overwhelming urge to fall asleep that represented the final stage of hypothermia. Her thoughts were becoming increasingly confused and disconnected, with memories of her childhood in Vancouver mixing randomly with her awareness of her current desperate situation. She found herself thinking about her parents and wondering if they would ever learn what had happened to their daughter in this remote corner of the Arctic wilderness. Michael reached the equipment cache at 12:47 a.m., his hands so numb from the cold that he had extreme difficulty operating the simple combination lock that protected the building's contents. The numbers that Dr. Hendricks had given them during the safety briefing seemed to have vanished from his memory, and he spent several precious minutes trying different combinations, while listening to the sounds of Bear 347's continued feeding from the direction of the main cabin. When the lock finally opened, the metallic click seemed as loud as a gunshot in the silent Arctic night. Inside the cache, Michael located the emergency radio and activated it with hands that were shaking from both cold and terror. His first attempt to contact the Churchill Northern Studies Center failed because his numb fingers could not properly operate the radio's controls, and his second attempt produced only static because he had not correctly tuned to the emergency frequency. At 12:52 a.m., nearly 2 hours after the attack had begun, Michael finally succeeded in establishing contact with the overnight operator at the research center. The conversation that followed would be recorded and later used as evidence in the official investigation into Emily's death. Michael's voice was barely recognizable due to the effects of hypothermia and extreme stress, and his report of the polar bear attack was initially met with disbelief from the radio operator, who had never received a call reporting an actual fatality during his 3 years of monitoring emergency communications. The operator's training took over after the initial shock, and within 5 minutes he had notified the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Manitoba Conservation and Water Stewardship Department, and the Churchill Search and Rescue Team. The rescue operation that was launched in response to Michael's distress call represented the largest emergency mobilization in Churchill's history, involving more than 40 personnel from multiple agencies working in coordination to reach the survivors and secure the scene of the attack. The operation was complicated by the presence of Bear 347, who was still feeding in and around Station Delta 7, making it impossible for rescuers to approach the area without significant risk to their own safety. The decision was made to use a helicopter equipped with tranquilizer equipment to neutralize the bear before ground teams could reach Michael and Sarah. Dr. Robert Mitchell, a wildlife veterinarian with 30 years of experience in polar bear management, was awakened at his home in Churchill at 1:15 a.m. and asked to coordinate the bear neutralization aspect of the rescue operation. Dr. Mitchell had participated in dozens of polar bear captures and relocations during his career, but he had never been called upon to deal with a bear that had killed and consumed a human being. The psychological pressure of this situation was enormous, as any mistake in the tranquilization process could result in additional fatalities among the rescue personnel. The helicopter carrying Dr. Mitchell and his tranquilizer equipment departed from Churchill at 1:45 a.m., piloted by Captain James Mackenzie, a former Canadian Armed Forces pilot who had extensive experience flying in Arctic conditions. The flight to Station Delta 7 required 35 minutes due to the need to navigate carefully in the darkness while avoiding the aurora borealis, which could interfere with the helicopter's electronic navigation systems. Captain Mackenzie's skill and experience would prove crucial to the success of the rescue operation, as landing a helicopter in the dark on rough terrain while a polar bear roamed the area required precision and courage that few pilots possessed. Meanwhile, at the equipment cache, Michael had retrieved heavy winter coats and boots for both himself and Sarah, though putting on the clothing required assistance due to the advanced hypothermia that had affected both survivors. Sarah was barely conscious when Michael returned to their hiding spot behind the propane shed, and her breathing had become shallow and irregular, indicating that her body was beginning to shut down. Michael's own condition was critical, with symptoms of hypothermia that included confusion, slurred speech, and loss of fine motor control that made it difficult for him to provide effective assistance to his fellow survivor. At 2:20 a.m., the rescue helicopter arrived at Station Delta 7 and immediately located Bear 347, who was still feeding on Emily's remains inside the destroyed cabin. Dr. Mitchell's first tranquilizer dart struck the bear in the shoulder, delivering a dose of Telazol that was calculated to render an 800-pound polar bear unconscious within 10 minutes. Bear 347's reaction to being darted was initially aggressive, with the massive predator emerging from the cabin and roaring his defiance at the helicopter that circled overhead. The bear's size and apparent health meant that the tranquilizer would take longer to take effect than normal, requiring Dr. Mitchell to fire a second dart to ensure complete sedation. The ground rescue team, consisting of paramedics Thomas Wright and Jennifer Patterson, RCMP Constable David Harrison, and Wildlife Officer Mark Thompson, had positioned themselves approximately 500 meters from Station Delta 7, while waiting for confirmation that Bear 347 had been successfully neutralized. The team was equipped with emergency medical supplies, additional tranquilizer equipment as backup, and a portable stretcher system designed for Arctic rescue operations. Their approach to the scene had to be carefully coordinated with the helicopter operations to ensure that they did not inadvertently interfere with the bear neutralization process. At 2:35 a.m., Bear 347 finally succumbed to the effects of the tranquilizer drugs and collapsed outside Station Delta 7, allowing the ground rescue team to begin their approach to locate the survivors. The bear's massive form lying motionless in the snow created an eerie scene that would be remembered by all the rescue personnel for the rest of their careers. Dr. Mitchell continued to monitor the bear from the helicopter while the ground team made their careful approach, ready to fire additional tranquilizer darts if Bear 347 showed any signs of regaining consciousness. Michael's radio call had provided the rescue team with the approximate location where he and Sarah were hiding, but finding them in the darkness required systematic searching with powerful flashlights and thermal imaging equipment. Paramedic Thomas Wright, who had 22 years of experience in emergency medicine and had treated numerous cases of severe hypothermia, immediately recognized that both survivors were in critical condition and would require immediate medical intervention to prevent death from exposure. Sarah Kim was unconscious when the rescue team found her at 2:41 a.m., her body temperature having dropped to 89 degrees Fahrenheit, well into the range considered life-threatening hypothermia. Her pulse was weak and irregular, her breathing was shallow, and her skin had taken on the waxy, pale appearance that indicated severe cold injury. Paramedic Wright began emergency warming procedures while paramedic Patterson prepared the portable stretcher and coordinated with the helicopter for immediate medical evacuation to the Churchill Health Center. Michael Lopez was conscious but severely hypothermic when the rescue team reached him, his core body temperature having dropped to 91 degrees Fahrenheit. His speech was slurred and confused, and he displayed the characteristic loss of fine motor control that accompanied advanced hypothermia. Despite his condition, Michael was able to provide the rescue team with a coherent account of the polar bear attack and Emily's death, information that would be crucial for the subsequent investigation and recovery of Emily's remains. The helicopter evacuation of Michael and Sarah from Station Delta 7 began at 2:55 a.m., with both survivors requiring careful handling to prevent additional medical complications during transport. The flight to Churchill Health Center took 45 minutes, during which paramedics Wright and Patterson worked to stabilize their patient's condition and begin the gradual re-warming process that would be crucial to their survival. The medical protocols for treating severe hypothermia required careful monitoring and controlled warming to prevent cardiac complications that could be fatal. At Churchill Health Center, Dr. Amanda Roberts, the emergency room physician on duty, had been preparing for the arrival of the hypothermia victims since receiving notification of the rescue operation at 2 a.m. Dr. Roberts, who had completed her medical training at the University of Manitoba and had chosen to practice in Churchill because of her interest in Arctic medicine, had treated dozens of hypothermia cases during her 5 years at the health center. But the circumstances of Michael and Sarah's case made their treatment particularly challenging and emotionally difficult. Sarah Kim's treatment required immediate intervention to prevent cardiac arrest, as her extremely low body temperature had put dangerous stress on her cardiovascular system. Dr. Roberts ordered the use of warm intravenous fluids and heated blankets while carefully monitoring Sarah's heart rhythm for signs of the irregular beats that could be fatal in severe hypothermia cases. The rewarming process had to be carefully controlled to prevent a sudden influx of cold blood from the extremities that could cause cardiac complications, making Sarah's treatment a delicate balance between aggressive intervention and cautious monitoring. Michael Lopez's treatment was somewhat less critical than Sarah's, as his slightly higher body temperature and continued consciousness indicated that his hypothermia, while severe, had not progressed to the life-threatening stage. However, Michael's psychological trauma was immediately apparent to the medical staff as he repeatedly asked about Emily's condition despite having witnessed her death firsthand. Dr. Roberts recognized that Michael would require immediate psychiatric support to begin processing the traumatic experience he had endured. The recovery of Emily Carter's remains from Station Delta 7 was delayed until daylight on January 13th, as the dangerous nature of the scene and the presence of Bear 347, even in his tranquilized state, made night operations too risky for the investigation team. The Manitoba Chief Medical Examiner, Dr. Patricia Singh, traveled to Churchill on the morning flight from Winnipeg to personally oversee the recovery and examination of Emily's body, recognizing that the unusual circumstances of the death would require careful documentation and analysis. Dr. Singh, who had served as Chief Medical Examiner for Manitoba for 12 years and had conducted thousands of autopsies during her career, had never examined the remains of a polar bear attack victim, making Emily's case both professionally challenging and personally disturbing. The extent of the damage to Emily's body was consistent with the feeding behavior of a large polar bear, with massive trauma to the head, neck, and torso that had resulted in rapid death from blood loss and catastrophic organ damage. The crime scene investigation at Station Delta 7 was conducted by RCMP Sergeant Michael Patterson, a forensic specialist who had been flown in from Winnipeg specifically to handle this unusual case. Sergeant Patterson's documentation of the scene included hundreds of photographs showing the destroyed window, the blood evidence inside the cabin, and the tracks left by Bear 347 during his approach and attack. The physical evidence clearly supported Michael and Sarah's account of the events, showing the systematic nature of the Bear's approach and the violence of the attack. Bear 347's fate was decided by a panel of wildlife management experts who convened in Churchill on the afternoon of January 13th to evaluate the situation and determine the appropriate response to a polar bear that had killed and consumed a human being. The panel, consisting of Dr. Richardson from Polar Bears International, Dr. Mitchell and senior wildlife officers from Manitoba Conservation, concluded that Bear 347 posed an ongoing threat to human safety and could not be relocated or returned to the wild population. The decision to euthanize Bear 347 was made at 3:30 p.m. on January 13th, and the procedure was carried out by Dr. Mitchell using a lethal injection of barbiturates while the bear remained under tranquilization. Bear 347's body was transported to the research facility at the Churchill Northern Studies Centre, where a complete necropsy would be performed to determine if there were any physical or health factors that might have contributed to his unusually aggressive behaviour toward humans. The necropsy results, completed 3 days later, revealed that Bear 347 was in excellent physical condition with no signs of disease, injury or malnutrition that could explain his decision to attack the research cabin. The bear's stomach contents confirmed that he had been feeding on Emily's remains, but also contained evidence of his normal diet of seals and other marine animals, indicating that hunger alone had not motivated the attack. Dr. Richardson's analysis of the bear's behavior suggested that Bear 347 had demonstrated an unusual level of boldness and curiosity about human activity that had ultimately led to the tragic confrontation. The media response to Emily Carter's death was immediate and intense, with news outlets across Canada and internationally reporting on the story of the university student who had been killed by a polar bear during a research expedition. The Churchill Northern Studies Centre was inundated with requests for interviews and information, prompting the centre's director, Dr. Alan Morrison, to hold a press conference on January 14th to address the public's questions and concerns about polar bear safety in the Churchill area. Dr. Morrison's statement to the media emphasized that polar bear attacks on humans were extremely rare, with Emily's death representing only the third documented fatal attack in the Churchill area in more than 50 years of research operations. He stressed that the Churchill Northern Studies Centre had maintained an exemplary safety record throughout its history, and that the protocols in place at Station Delta 7 had been considered adequate based on decades of experience with polar bear behaviour in the region. The University of Manitoba issued its own statement expressing condolences to Emily's family and announcing that a comprehensive review of safety protocols for field research would be conducted to determine if additional measures were needed to protect students participating in future expeditions. The university also announced the establishment of the Emily Carter Memorial Scholarship for students pursuing marine biology research, ensuring that Emily's passion for Arctic science would be remembered and honored for generations to come. Emily's parents, Dr. Margaret Carter and Professor James Carter traveled to Churchill on January 14th to be with their daughter's remains and to meet with the investigators and medical personnel who had been involved in the case. The meeting between Emily's parents and Michael Lopez was particularly emotional, as Michael struggled to find words to express his grief and survivors' guilt over his inability to save their daughter from the polar bear's attack. Dr. Margaret Carter despite her overwhelming grief, found the strength to comfort Michael and Sarah, recognizing that they too were victims of the tragic circumstances that had claimed her daughter's life. Her medical background helped her understand the physical and psychological trauma that both survivors had endured, and she urged them to seek ongoing counseling and support as they began the long process of recovery from their ordeal. The funeral service for Emily Rose Carter was held at Westminster United Church in Winnipeg on January 18, 2025, with more than 500 people in attendance, including family, friends, university colleagues, and members of the Arctic research community who had known and respected Emily's dedication to marine biology. The service celebrated Emily's life and her passion for understanding and protecting the Arctic environment that had ultimately claimed her life, with speakers emphasizing her intelligence, curiosity, and commitment to scientific discovery. Michael Lopez and Sarah Kim both attended Emily's funeral, though their appearance showed the physical and emotional toll of their experience at Station Delta 7. Michael had been treated for frostbite on his fingers and toes, which required several weeks of medical care to prevent permanent damage, while Sarah had suffered more severe frostbite injuries to her feet that would require ongoing treatment and possibly surgery to repair damaged tissue. The psychological trauma experienced by both survivors manifested in different ways during the weeks following the attack. Michael found himself unable to sleep through the night without experiencing vivid nightmares about the polar bear attack, often waking up in a panic with the sound of breaking glass and Emily's final scream echoing in his memory. Sarah developed severe agoraphobia and panic attacks that made it difficult for her to leave her family's home in Vancouver, requiring intensive therapy and medication to help her cope with the trauma. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a psychologist specializing in trauma recovery who was retained by the University of Manitoba to provide counseling for Michael and Sarah, recognized that both students were suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder that would require years of treatment. Dr. Walsh's experience with survivors of violent attacks had taught her that witnessing the death of a friend or colleague often created complicated grief reactions that were more difficult to treat than trauma experienced by direct victims. The official investigation into Emily's death was conducted by a joint team, including the RCMP, Manitoba Conservation and Water Stewardship, the Manitoba Chief Medical Examiner's Office, and workplace safety investigators from the provincial government. The investigation's mandate was to determine the exact circumstances of the attack, evaluate the adequacy of existing safety protocols, and make recommendations for preventing similar tragedies in the future. The investigation team's report, released on March 15, 2025, concluded that Emily's death had resulted from an unpredictable and extremely rare encounter with an aggressive polar bear whose behavior fell outside the normal parameters of polar bear-human interactions in the Churchill area. The report found that existing safety protocols at Station Delta 7 were consistent with industry standards and that the research team had followed all prescribed safety procedures leading up to the attack. However, the investigation report also identified several recommendations for improving safety at remote research stations, including the installation of reinforced windows designed to withstand polar bear attacks, the placement of motion-activated deterrent systems around research facilities, and the requirement for immediate helicopter evacuation capabilities during all research operations in polar bear territory. The Churchill Northern Studies Centre accepted all of the investigation's recommendations and announced a comprehensive upgrade of safety systems at all remote research stations, including Station Delta 7, which was rebuilt with enhanced security features designed to prevent future polar bear intrusions. The cost of these improvements exceeded $2.3 million, funded through a combination of government grants, insurance settlements, and private donations from the research community. The legal implications of Emily's death were addressed through a coroner's inquest that was held in Churchill from April 7th to 11th, 2025, with testimony from more than 30 witnesses, including the survivors, rescue personnel, wildlife experts, and safety officials. The inquest jury's verdict classified Emily's death as accidental, finding that no individual or organization bore legal responsibility for the tragic circumstances that had led to the polar bear attack. However, the Carter family filed a civil lawsuit against the Churchill Northern Studies Centre and the University of Manitoba in September 2025, alleging that inadequate safety measures and insufficient risk assessment had contributed to their daughter's death. The lawsuit, which sought $7 million in damages, argued that the research organizations had failed to protect Emily, despite knowing the risks associated with conducting research in polar bear territory. The civil case was settled out of court in February 2026 for an undisclosed amount, with the settlement agreement including provisions for the establishment of enhanced safety protocols for student researchers and funding for ongoing polar bear research that would improve understanding of human-bear interactions in Arctic environments. Both the Churchill Northern Studies Centre and the University of Manitoba agreed to the settlement without admitting fault or liability for Emily's death. Michael Lopez's recovery from his physical and psychological trauma was a gradual process that required him to take a leave of absence from his studies at the University of Manitoba during the spring semester of 2025. He returned to his family's home in Thompson, Manitoba, where his mother's traditional healing practices and his grandfather's wisdom about dealing with traumatic experiences helped him begin to process what he had witnessed during that horrific night at Station Delta 7. Michael's decision to change his academic focus from environmental science to trauma counseling was influenced by his recognition that his experience as a survivor of extreme trauma gave him unique insights into the recovery process. He completed his undergraduate degree through distance learning and went on to pursue a master's degree in clinical psychology, with the goal of helping other trauma survivors navigate the complex process of healing and recovery. Sarah Kim's recovery was more complicated and prolonged, as her severe hypothermia injuries required multiple surgeries to repair frostbite damage to her feet, and her psychological trauma manifested in ways that significantly impacted her ability to function in daily life. She was unable to complete her studies at the University of Manitoba and ultimately transferred to the University of British Columbia, where she could remain close to her family support system while receiving ongoing medical and psychological treatment. Sarah's career aspirations shifted from veterinary medicine to wildlife photography, a change that allowed her to maintain her connection to the natural world while avoiding the direct contact with large animals that triggered her post-traumatic stress responses. Her photography work eventually became a form of therapy, helping her process her trauma while creating art that honored the memory of her friend Emily and raised awareness about the challenges of conducting research in dangerous environments. The long-term impact of Emily Carter's death on the Arctic research community was significant and lasting, prompting a comprehensive re-evaluation of safety protocols and risk assessment procedures for field research in polar bear territory. The Emily Carter Safety Initiative, launched jointly by the University of Manitoba and Polar Bears International in September 2025, established new standards for remote research operations that have since been adopted by research institutions across Canada and internationally. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, who had led the research expedition during which Emily was killed, struggled with profound guilt and responsibility despite the investigation's conclusion that no one could have prevented the attack. Dr. Hendricks took early retirement from the University of Manitoba in August 2025 and has not returned to field research, instead focusing her efforts on laboratory-based studies and the development of safety protocols for future researchers. The scientific legacy of Emily Carter's work lives on through the research that she had begun during her final expedition to Station Delta 7. Her ice samples, which survived the polar bear attack, were analyzed by Dr. Hendricks and other researchers, leading to the discovery of several previously unknown microorganisms that have significant implications for understanding how Arctic ecosystems are adapting to climate change. The results of this research were published in the Journal of Arctic Marine Biology in a special memorial issue dedicated to Emily's contributions to the field. Bear 347's attack on Station Delta 7 marked a turning point in polar bear management strategies in the Churchill area, prompting wildlife officials to implement more aggressive monitoring and intervention protocols for bears that demonstrate unusual interest in human activities. The enhanced tracking system, which uses GPS collars and satellite monitoring to track bear movements in real time, has since prevented several potentially dangerous encounters between polar bears and research personnel. The psychological impact of Emily's death extended beyond the immediate survivors to include the entire Arctic research community, many of whom had known Emily personally or had worked with Dr. Hendricks over the years. The recognition that such a violent and unpredictable attack could occur despite all reasonable safety precautions forced many researchers to confront the inherent risks of their chosen profession and make difficult decisions about whether to continue working in dangerous environments. The memorial service held at Station Delta 7 on the first anniversary of Emily's death brought together researchers, wildlife officials, and community members from Churchill to honor her memory and reflect on the lessons learned from the tragedy. The rebuilt research station now features a memorial plaque dedicated to Emily Carter, ensuring that future researchers will remember her contribution to Arctic science and the ultimate sacrifice she made in pursuit of knowledge about the polar environment. Michael Lopez returned to Station Delta 7 for the memorial service, marking his first time back at the site since that horrific night in January 2025. His emotional speech at the ceremony emphasized Emily's passion for research and her excitement about the scientific discoveries that had motivated her to participate in the Arctic expedition. Michael's presence at the memorial represented an important step in his own healing process, allowing him to honor his friend's memory while confronting the traumatic memories associated with the location. Sarah Kim was unable to attend the memorial service due to ongoing treatment for her post-traumatic stress disorder, but she contributed to the ceremony through a written statement that was read aloud by Dr. Morrison. Sarah's message emphasized Emily's kindness, intelligence, and dedication to understanding the Arctic environment, and expressed her hope that Emily's death would lead to improved safety measures that would protect future researchers from similar tragedies. The scientific research conducted at Station Delta 7 continues under the enhanced safety protocols that were implemented following Emily's death, with researchers now working in larger teams and with continuous helicopter support during all field operations. The station's research focus has expanded to include studies of polar bear behavior and human-wildlife interactions, ensuring that Emily's death contributes to better understanding of the very predators that claimed her life. The impact of Emily Carter's death on polar bear conservation efforts has been complex and sometimes controversial, as some wildlife advocates argued that the killing of Bear 347 represented an overreaction that stigmatized polar bears as dangerous monsters rather than recognizing them as apex predators whose behavior was natural and predictable within their ecosystem. However, most conservation organizations supported the decision to euthanize Bear 347, recognizing that a bear that had killed and consumed a human represented an ongoing threat that could not be safely managed through relocation or other non-lethal measures. The educational impact of Emily's story has been significant in raising awareness about the realities of conducting scientific research in dangerous environments, with her case becoming a standard example in university courses about field research, safety, and risk management. The video documentary Emily's Arctic, produced by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in 2026, brought her story to a national audience and sparked important conversations about the balance between scientific discovery and researcher safety. The financial impact of Emily's death on the Churchill Northern Studies Centre was substantial, with the organization facing increased insurance premiums, expensive safety upgrades, and reduced enrollment in field research programs as students and parents became more aware of the risks associated with Arctic research. However, the center's commitment to continuing Emily's research legacy has helped maintain its reputation as a leading institution for Arctic science, despite the tragedy that occurred at Station Delta 7. The international response to Emily's death included expressions of sympathy and support from research institutions around the world, many of which had their own experiences with wildlife-related accidents and injuries during field research operations. The International Association of Arctic Researchers established the Emily Carter Memorial Fund in 2025 to support safety improvements at remote research facilities and to provide emergency assistance to researchers and their families affected by field research accidents. Emily Carter's parents have become advocates for improved safety protocols in field research, working with universities and research organizations to develop better training programs and safety equipment for students participating in dangerous research expeditions. Their advocacy work has helped ensure that Emily's death serves as a catalyst for positive change rather than simply a tragic reminder of the risks inherent in scientific research. The psychological support services available to field researchers have been significantly expanded in response to Emily's death, and the recognition that exposure to traumatic events is a common occupational hazard for scientists working in remote and dangerous locations. The Researcher Trauma Support Network, established in 2026, provides confidential counseling services and peer support groups for researchers who have experienced traumatic events during fieldwork. The story of Emily Carter's death continues to resonate within the Arctic research community 5 years after the tragedy occurred, serving as a sobering reminder of the unpredictable nature of wildlife encounters and the importance of maintaining constant vigilance when working in polar bear territory. Her legacy lives on through the enhanced safety protocols that now protect researchers across the Arctic, ensuring that her death was not in vain, but rather contributed to the safety and security of future generations of scientists. The rebuilt Station Delta 7 now serves as both a functional research facility and a memorial to Emily Carter, with enhanced security features that represent the state-of-the-art in wildlife-resistant construction. The station's reinforced windows, Motion-activated deterrent systems and emergency communication equipment provide multiple layers of protection that would have prevented the type of attack that claimed Emily's life, ensuring that future researchers can work safely while continuing the important scientific work that Emily was so passionate about. Michael Lopez completed his graduate studies in clinical psychology and now works as a trauma counselor specializing in survivors of wildlife attacks and other outdoor-related traumatic events. His unique perspective as both a survivor and a mental health professional has made him a sought-after expert in the field of trauma recovery, and he regularly speaks at conferences and training sessions for researchers, guides, and others who work in dangerous outdoor environments. Sarah Kim's wildlife photography has gained international recognition, with her images of Arctic wildlife serving as powerful reminders of both the beauty and the danger of the natural world. Her work has been featured in National Geographic, Canadian Geographic, and numerous other publications, and she has used her platform to advocate for both wildlife conservation and improved safety measures for researchers working in remote locations. The polar bear population in the Churchill area has continued to thrive despite the removal of bear 347 from the ecosystem, with annual monitoring surveys showing stable numbers and healthy reproductive rates. The enhanced monitoring and tracking systems implemented following Emily's death have provided valuable data about polar bear behavior and movement patterns that has contributed to both conservation efforts and human safety measures. The Churchill community has largely embraced the changes and improvements that resulted from Emily's death, recognizing that the enhanced safety measures and increased research activity have brought both economic benefits and improved scientific understanding of the Arctic environment. The annual Emily Carter Memorial Lecture, held at the Churchill Northern Studies Center each January, brings prominent Arctic researchers to the community to share their latest findings and honor Emily's memory. The legal and regulatory framework governing Arctic research has been significantly strengthened in response to Emily's death, with new requirements for safety planning, risk assessment, and emergency response capabilities that apply to all research operations in polar bear territory. These regulations, while sometimes viewed as burdensome by researchers, have created a culture of safety awareness that has prevented numerous potential accidents and close calls in the years since their implementation. The scientific community's understanding of polar bear behavior has been enhanced by the detailed analysis of Bear 347's actions leading up to and during the attack on Station Delta 7. This analysis has revealed important insights into the factors that may trigger aggressive behavior in polar bears, including environmental stressors, food availability, and human activity patterns that may influence bear behavior in ways that were not previously understood. Emily Rose Carter's death at the age of 19 represents one of the most tragic losses in the history of Arctic research, cutting short a promising scientific career and devastating the lives of her family, friends, and colleagues. However, her legacy lives on through the safety improvements, research advances, and educational initiatives that were inspired by her death, ensuring that future researchers will benefit from the lessons learned from her tragic encounter with Bear 347 on that cold January night at Station Delta 7. The 5 minutes that ended Emily's life have led to decades of improved safety and scientific understanding, making her death a catalyst for positive change that honors her memory and protects the researchers who continue her important work in the Arctic wilderness.